The oceans have long been arenas of both human ambition and unfathomable mystery, their depths concealing the triumphs and tragedies of naval history. Across centuries, ships and submarines have vanished without warning, entire crews swallowed by currents, storms, or circumstances that remain unexplained. Some missions began as routine patrols or strategic maneuvers, yet ended in sudden silence, leaving behind fragments of wreckage, whispered accounts, and enduring questions. As you journey through this video, you will discover not only the events themselves, but the strange and unsettling details that keep these naval disasters shrouded in mystery. From battles lost to disappearances in uncharted waters, each story reveals the unpredictable and often perilous relationship between humans and the sea, inviting viewers to confront the secrets that the deep still refuses to surrender. USS Cyclops, 1918, Atlantic Ocean. In the early months of 1918, when the Atlantic had become a theatre of invisible dangers, a single vessel began its final voyage from the calm harbours of Brazil toward the eastern coast of the United States. The USS Cyclops, a massive naval collier of the Proteus class, measured more than 500 feet in length and carried a displacement so great that sailors referred to her as a moving island. She was built not for battle but for endurance. Her purpose was to transport coal, the vital fuel of the Navy's growing fleet. Yet the weight she carried on that last voyage was not coal alone. Beneath her decks lay a cargo of manganese ore bound for steel production, and aboard her were more than 300 men who expected a routine return to Baltimore. None of them would arrive. The ship had left the port of Rio de Janeiro in February, her holds heavy and her engines labouring against the humid air that hung over Guanabara Bay. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander George Worley, was known for his stern manner and unbending discipline. The crew had grown accustomed to his strict routines, though some later recalled that his behaviour in those final weeks seemed erratic, an observation that would gain eerie significance when the ship disappeared. The Cyclops' intended route would carry her north along the Brazilian coast, through the Caribbean Sea and into the open Atlantic before turning northwest toward the continental United States. She was expected to make port in Baltimore by mid-March. The first leg of the journey unfolded without incident. The Cyclops stopped briefly in Bahia and then continued to Barbados for refueling and minor provisions. On March 4th, 1918, she departed Bridgetown Harbour under clear skies, moving slowly into open water. Her departure was witnessed by harbour officials and merchant crews who later testified that the ship appeared in good condition and that her commander had given no indication of distress or delay. From that moment onward, no message was received, no distress signal transmitted, and no trace of the ship or her crew was ever found. At the time, the world was at war, and the Atlantic teemed with rumours of German submarines. Naval intelligence first suspected that the Cyclops might have been torpedoed, yet not a single German U-boat in the region reported an attack matching her disappearance, and wartime records later declassified contained no such encounter. The sea, it seemed, had swallowed a vessel too large and too visible to vanish unnoticed. As days turned into weeks, concern grew at the Navy's headquarters in Washington. Attempts to contact the ship by wireless produced only silence. Search vessels were dispatched along her presumed route, scanning for oil slicks, debris, or lifeboats, but the ocean offered nothing. Even drift patterns that might have carried wreckage toward nearby islands yielded no evidence. The Cyclops had vanished so completely that some officers refused to believe she had sunk at all. They entertained the faint hope that she might have been captured or diverted to a hidden anchorage. But those speculations too faded with time. Investigations into the disappearance began almost immediately. The Navy convened a board of inquiry that examined every possibility: structural failure, sabotage, weather, and human error. Reports from the Caribbean indicated that the region had been calm during the days following her departure. Meteorological data confirmed there were no recorded storms strong enough to destroy a vessel of her size. Attention then turned to her cargo. The manganese ore she carried was far denser than coal, and if loaded improperly, it might have shifted in rough seas, compromising her stability. But calculations suggested that such a shift, while dangerous, could not have caused the ship to vanish without any call for help. Then came the matter of her commander. George Worley was a German-born officer who had immigrated to the United States decades earlier. His loyalty was never officially questioned during his career, Yet the coincidence of his origins with the wartime climate drew suspicion. After the ship's loss, rumours spread that he'd sympathised with Germany and might have attempted to defect or deliver the ship to enemy forces. These claims were investigated but never substantiated. The Navy found no evidence of espionage, and those who had served under Worley testified only to his temper and eccentricities, not to treason. Over time, more speculative theories emerged. Some claimed the Cyclops had been struck by a rogue wave, a sudden wall of water capable of overwhelming even the largest ships. Others suggested spontaneous combustion within her coal bunkers, or the ignition of gas pockets formed by the manganese ore. None of these could explain the total absence of wreckage. In ordinary sinkings, fragments, lifebuoys, barrels, pieces of wood eventually surface. In this case, not a single plank or crate was ever recovered. By the early 1920s, the Cyclops had become a cautionary legend within the Navy. Her name appeared on memorial plaques beside the names of ships lost in combat, though hers was not a casualty of war. She was instead marked as cause unknown. Decades later, when oceanographers began mapping the seabed with sonar, renewed efforts were made to locate her remains. The search area, however, spanned hundreds of thousands of square miles across some of the Atlantic's deepest trenches. Nothing resembling the Cyclops was ever identified. As interest in the unexplained grew through the mid-20th century, the ship's disappearance was often linked to what writers called the Bermuda Triangle, a region bounded loosely by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. Though the term would not appear until long after the event, the Cyclops became one of its earliest and most cited mysteries. Naval historians, however, regarded such claims with skepticism, noting that the ship's last known position lay far south of that area. Still, the coincidence of geography, an empty sea and a missing vessel proved irresistible to those drawn to patterns of the uncanny. Survivors' families pressed for answers long after official inquiries had closed. Letters preserved in naval archives reveal their frustration. They wrote to senators, admirals, and even the president, pleading for renewed searches. One mother asked simply whether her son's body might be brought home if the ship were ever found. None of the families received closure. In later years, several relatives reported receiving postcards or telegrams they believed came from missing crewmen, messages bearing signatures and handwriting that seemed familiar but unverifiable. The Navy dismissed these as hoaxes, yet the persistence of such claims added another layer to the mystery's long afterlife. Maritime engineers who have studied the case note that the Cyclops was a unique ship even among her class. Her design included a single enormous engine mounted on a narrow keel, and she had a known tendency to roll heavily in rough seas. A structural failure, particularly near the midsection, could have caused her to break apart suddenly. But this hypothesis faces the same problem as all the others: the total absence of floating debris. For a ship of such size, some remnants should have remained. When the Navy commissioned sister ships, Proteus and Nereus, they were built to nearly identical specifications. In a strange twist, both would also disappear years later during World War II, each carrying heavy cargoes through the same general region of the Western Atlantic. None sent a distress call, none were found. The recurrence deepened the Cyclops' legend, and led some within the Navy to whisper that there was something inherently cursed about the design. Engineers rejected superstition, but the pattern was difficult to ignore. In the modern era, several expeditions have proposed to locate the wreck using deep-sea submersibles and magnetic anomaly detectors. Satellite data has narrowed potential resting places to a few trenches northeast of Barbados, where depths exceed 16,000 feet. At such extremes, even large vessels can disintegrate and vanish beneath layers of silt. Yet without definitive evidence, the Cyclops remains classified as missing. Her coordinates are marked only by an empty entry on naval charts. Today, more than a century after she sailed, the name USS Cyclops endures as a synonym for disappearance. Maritime researchers continue to revisit her case, examining every fragment of record and every whisper of rumour, hoping to identify the moment her fate was sealed. Was it a catastrophic mechanical failure, a sudden shift of cargo, an explosion, or something entirely unforeseen? Each theory ends in the same silence that surrounds her resting place. The Atlantic, indifferent and vast, keeps its own counsel. Those who study the sea often say that every ship leaves a trace, that even in death there are clues etched into currents and sand. The Cyclops defies that wisdom. She departed under calm skies with a crew of ordinary men and a cargo bound for industry, and then simply ceased to exist. No distress call, no wreckage, no survivor, only the quiet certainty that somewhere between Brazil and the American coast, an entire vessel was erased from history. And in the stillness of that erasure, the ocean seems to hold its breath, as if waiting for someone to finally listen to what it has never said. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, 1845, Arctic Ocean. In the northernmost reaches where the sea forgets its own motion, the Arctic stretches outward like an endless sheet of silence. Here, wind and frost are the only voices, sculpting the ice into shapes that outlast memory. To look upon this region is to see time itself frozen, movement halted, sound absorbed, colour drained from existence. Into this pale and motionless world, two ships once ventured with the quiet conviction that discovery was destiny. Their names, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, would one day feel prophetic, echoing through centuries of unanswered questions and vanished lives. When the two ships departed the Thames in 1845, optimism seemed a form of armour against the unknown. Under the command of Sir John Franklin, a seasoned explorer in his 60s, the expedition sought to chart the last unclaimed passage through the Arctic, the Northwest Passage, a route that promised to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through a maze of frozen channels. Both vessels were reinforced for ice, fitted with steam engines adapted from railway locomotives, and provisioned for 3 years of exploration. Officers carried fine silverware and a small library of books. They expected hardship, but not oblivion. To many in London, it was a mission of science and empire. To those who watched the ships vanish down the Thames, it was a departure into myth. Weeks turned into months as the ice grew thick and the compasses faltered. The Erebus and Terror made it as far as Lancaster Sound before winter seized them in a grip that would not relent. Men chipped at the ice by day and listened to its shifting groans by night. Provisions began to dwindle, food preserved in lead-soldered tins grew tainted, poisoning those it was meant to sustain. Illness spread through the cramped decks as temperatures plunged. Yet no one outside those frozen channels knew of their struggle. The Arctic sky, indifferent and luminous, swallowed every trace of the men's endurance, their voices muffled beneath layers of snow. As the seasons changed, rescue expeditions began to follow, at first out of duty, then out of desperation. The British Admiralty sent ship after ship northward, but found only ice floes and broken fragments drifting aimlessly. Rumours began to replace reports. Inuit hunters spoke of ghostly vessels locked in ice, and of white men wandering the tundra, skeletal and silent, their eyes hollow from hunger and frostbite. Those who later searched for them found only traces: a camp on Beachy Island with 3 graves marked by wooden crosses, a few personal effects sealed in permafrost, and scraps of journals recording the slow unravelling of discipline and hope. One note, discovered years later in a cairn on King William Island, revealed the expedition's grim descent. It stated that the ships had become trapped since 1846, that Franklin had died the following year, and that the remaining men had attempted to march south in search of rescue. The handwriting grew uneven, the sentences shorter, as if written by a man freezing as he wrote. Around them, the Arctic remained unmoved, a realm so vast it could erase entire histories without effort. Among the few possessions recovered from the ice were fragments of journals and technical instruments that hinted at confusion within the command structure. Some pages bore differing handwriting, suggesting that leadership shifted multiple times after Franklin's death. Measurements of latitude and longitude grew inconsistent, as if the remaining officers had lost track of their position entirely. Scrawled annotations mentioned the destruction of sledges and the abandonment of heavy equipment, decisions likely made in desperation as the men tried to traverse the endless snowfields. Each note feels less like a record and more like a plea, an attempt to leave behind some trace of order before the last of them vanished into the white. Those who came afterward to piece together the story faced not only the ice, but time itself. By the late 19th century, skeletal remains were uncovered along the shores, many showing signs of starvation and disturbingly, evidence of cannibalism. Bones bore the marks of knives, hinting at the desperation that had taken hold in the expedition's final days. Victorian England recoiled at the suggestion. The notion that naval officers of the Crown had resorted to such acts seemed impossible. Yet the Arctic offers no comfort to human sensibility. It preserves truth without sentiment, encasing horror and heroism alike beneath the same indifferent frost. Decades passed before the silence stirred again. Long after the Franklin expedition had faded from living memory, researchers and explorers continued to search the Arctic's labyrinthine waterways. In 2014, the wreck of HMS Erebus was finally discovered, resting upright in the icy waters of Queen Maud Gulf, its timbers astonishingly intact. 2 years later, HMS Terror was found as well, preserved so perfectly it seemed capable of sailing again. The discovery should have brought closure, but instead deepened the enigma. Why had the ships drifted far apart? Why had no one survived, even with supplies that should have lasted for years? Inside the Terror's cabins, objects remained undisturbed. A desk, a teacup, a pair of boots, as if awaiting the return of men who would never come. What researchers uncovered within the wrecks blurred the boundary between evidence and haunting. Wooden partitions stood firm, drawers held their contents, and the faint outlines of personal belongings hinted at a story that had ended mid-sentence. Sediment covered the decks like years of accumulated silence. Even the ship's bell remained still, unclaimed by sound. Modern technology could map every rivet and plank, yet it could not answer the questions that lingered. What decisions had been made in those final months? What fears had broken the will of even the most disciplined men, or what final thoughts passed between them as the ice closed in? Beneath layers of sediment, divers also found sealed glass bottles containing what appeared to be medicinal compounds and preserved botanical samples. These discoveries suggested that the crew had been attempting rudimentary experiments, perhaps testing the effects of cold on rations and medicine, or studying local flora for sustenance. Nearby, a small camera lens and pieces of photographic equipment were found, a revelation that the men may have tried to document their ordeal in images now lost to the depths. If such photographs were ever taken, they remain undiscovered, their negatives dissolved into the same darkness that holds the rest of the expedition's unspoken record. To the Inuit communities whose ancestors had witnessed fragments of this tragedy, the story was never lost, only misunderstood. Their oral histories spoke of encounters with weak frostbitten sailors, of ships crushed by moving ice, and of strange relics found scattered along the shoreline. In their accounts, the land had absorbed the expedition, consuming it without malice, as it had consumed countless wanderers before. The Arctic, to them, was not hostile but sovereign, and what vanished within it belonged to its stillness. Today, the wrecks of Erebus and Terror rest beneath layers of silt and darkness, guarded by currents that shift like breathing. Each summer, divers return to document their condition, descending into a silence that remains absolute. They find journals dissolved to pulp, instruments corroded beyond use, and yet an uncanny sense of presence lingers, as though something unseen still occupies the decks. The wrecks endure not as relics of failure, but as monuments to human persistence meeting the edge of the unknowable. In the end, the expedition's true story may never surface. What remains beneath that frozen weight is not merely wood and iron, but the quiet certainty that some journeys are meant to vanish. This leaves behind only the outline of where courage met the cold. And somewhere beneath the ice, the ships still wait for the thaw that will never come. INS Dakar, 1968, Eastern Mediterranean. Before the sea gave its silence, the radios began to fail. In control rooms along Israel's coast, operators leaned closer to the static, unsure whether the brief bursts of sound were signals or echoes. The Dakar had been checking in every few hours during its journey home, its transmissions crisp and predictable. Then, without alarm or final code, the rhythm ended. The frequency that once carried human voices dissolved into a hiss that no one could interpret. For days, technicians recalibrated equipment, believing the fault lay in wires and antennas. Only later would they realize the silence was not mechanical. It was the sound of something vanishing beneath thousands of meters of water. The INS Dakar had once belonged to another navy, another flag, another purpose. Built in Britain during the Second World War as HMS Totem, the submarine had served under the Royal Navy before being sold to Israel in 1965. Engineers spent months refitting her, updating radar, installing Israeli electronics, and reinforcing her hull for deeper dives. The crew was handpicked from among Israel's best, experienced submariners trained in British procedures but bound now by their own national mission. In every photograph taken before departure, their expressions hold a quiet pride. The vessel represented more than a weapon. It was a statement of independence, a promise that Israel's small navy could command the same depths as its larger rivals. Its departure from Portsmouth in January 1968 was meant to mark renewal, not disappearance. The submarine sailed west through the Atlantic before cutting through the Strait of Gibraltar into the calm of the Mediterranean. The weather was fair and the seas remained gentle. On board, Captain Yaakov Ranen maintained strict routines. Drills, radio reports and depth tests performed with practiced precision. The mission's endpoint was Haifa, where families and officials awaited their arrival with a ceremony planned. The Dakar was expected to surface on January 29th. Instead, somewhere between Crete and Cyprus, it slipped out of the world's awareness. The last message arrived without urgency, a routine signal sent across the Mediterranean's calm surface. At 02 hours on January 25th, the Dakar transmitted its position, reporting that all was well. No distress, no sign of interference. The next message, due only hours later, never came. Israeli command waited, first with patience, then with disbelief. They sent urgent requests to nearby navies, British, Turkish, Greek, and American ships, to monitor for signals. Nothing answered. Even distress buoys designed to release automatically if the hull was compromised remained untriggered. For a submarine equipped with advanced safety systems, the total absence of data was beyond logic. It was as if the vessel had not sunk but had simply ceased to exist. When the silence persisted, ships and aircraft swept the sea in widening circles. Israeli and British vessels crisscrossed the eastern Mediterranean, their sonar pings returning only the faint resonance of depth. Reconnaissance planes traced the surface for oil slicks or debris, while radio operators replayed hours of static, hoping to extract meaning from noise. Families gathered along Haifa's harbour, waiting for news that never clarified. Reports surfaced of a faint distress call intercepted by a Cypriot station, but the coordinates led nowhere. The search stretched for weeks until the sea returned to its normal indifference, erasing the disturbance. In Tel Aviv's Naval Command Center, engineers constructed scale diagrams of the submarine's course, plotting its every recorded coordinate against seafloor topography. They calculated drift ranges, pressure tolerances, and acoustic profiles, trying to determine how far the Dakar could have travelled after its final transmission. Each recalculation seemed to contradict the last. Temperature gradients and salinity layers distorted sonar returns, producing false echoes that mimicked wrecks. Officers spent sleepless nights arguing over which blip was real, which was an illusion. The maps soon became covered in pencil marks that formed a kind of labyrinth, evidence not of discovery but of confusion rendered on paper. Speculation filled the void left by communication. Some claimed the Dakar had suffered catastrophic structural failure, its pressure hull collapsing under depth. Others believed it might have struck an underwater mine left over from earlier wars. There were whispers, too, of hostile engagement, of a hidden skirmish in Cold War shadows. Analysts studied seismic data and ocean currents, plotting hypothetical descent paths, yet none aligned with the evidence or lack thereof. Intelligence agencies traded fragments of rumour but not certainty. For a nation barely 20 years old, the loss carried both strategic and symbolic weight. The disappearance of an entire crew without witness, explanation or trace. It was not until 1999 that the sea relented, revealing what it had taken. After 31 years of speculation, an American survey vessel contracted by Israel discovered the wreck nearly 3 kilometers beneath the surface, roughly halfway between Crete and Cyprus. Sonar images showed the Dakar resting upright on the seabed, its bow crushed inward but otherwise intact. The position was hundreds of miles from the area originally searched. When remotely operated cameras descended, they found the hull preserved in eerie stillness. Letters still visible on the side, instruments frozen mid-function. Inside, no bodies remained, only the outlines of human presence, a shoe, a mug, a tangle of wires and notebooks turned to pulp. Amid the scattered remnants, a fragment of a pressure gauge was found, its needle frozen past the danger mark as if caught in a final moment of strain. Metallurgists later determined that the gauge had likely shattered during an uncontrolled descent, supporting theories of rapid implosion. Yet traces of oxidation on nearby panels hinted that sections of the submarine might have remained intact for several minutes before total collapse. That contradiction became one of the mission's most haunting details, proof that, even as the hull failed, the vessel may have lingered long enough for its crew to understand what was coming. Even then, questions remained sealed within the steel. Investigators concluded that the submarine had likely exceeded its safe diving depth during a rapid descent, perhaps due to a malfunctioning valve or misread gauge. Yet the evidence contradicted complete certainty. No explosion scars, no signs of flooding before implosion. The distress buoy found years earlier, washed ashore near Gaza, suggested the submarine had surfaced, if only briefly, before vanishing again. Some engineers speculated that human error had set a wrong ballast configuration. Others proposed a sudden mechanical failure in the control tower. Every hypothesis met another that disproved it. The wreck had surrendered form, not truth. Within the quiet geometry of wreckage lies the unspoken story of human design meeting the deep. Engineers studying the remains noted how every bolt and beam bore the marks of both ingenuity and fragility. Even the thick steel seemed humbled by the pressure that crushed it inward like paper. The Mediterranean, so often seen as hospitable compared to other oceans, had revealed another side, a vastness capable of swallowing technology and testimony alike. For the families of the lost 44 sailors, the discovery offered closure without understanding. The men were declared at rest, yet the sea's silence persisted, as though guarding whatever final minutes had passed within that narrow cylinder of light and steel. From that depth, the Dakar has become less a wreck than a warning, a reminder that even in an age of signals and satellites, disappearance remains possible. The submarine rests in perpetual darkness, its instruments frozen at the moment the world stopped listening. Divers who have seen it describe a scene untouched by time, wires suspended like veins, silt drifting through open hatches, a compass still pointing nowhere. What happened in the final moments remains a question unanswered, not by lack of evidence, but by the nature of the sea itself, a place that records everything yet tells nothing, and far below the surface the radios still whisper to no one at all. USS Thresher, 1963 Atlantic Ocean. From the depths of New England's cold waters, the USS Thresher began her final descent on a morning meant only for routine trials. She was the pride of post-war engineering, the lead of her class, a nuclear-powered attack submarine designed to outpace and outlast every vessel that came before. To those who built her, the Thresher was proof that precision could master the deep, that metal, when forged and sealed with human intellect, could withstand even the crushing silence of the Atlantic. But in the darkness below, mastery was never certain, and confidence had a way of turning into an echo. Inside the steel labyrinth of the Thresher, 129 men worked in the strict rhythm of submarine life. The vessel was a world of ordered confinement, humming turbines, sonar pings, the constant whisper of filtered air. Engineers monitored gauges with the calm assurance of repetition, while the captain directed maneuvers with the careful restraint of someone who knew how narrow the line was between control and chaos. The submarine had been diving to test limits, following protocols refined through endless simulations. Yet below 1,000 feet, where sunlight no longer mattered, the deep does not always follow design. What followed was not panic, but precision faltering by degrees, a sound of metal against pressure, a vibration that shouldn't have been there. Then a message, faint but measured, sent to the surface support ship, experiencing minor difficulties. The words carried no alarm, only the cool efficiency expected of naval command. But on the skylark above, those listening recognized something strained beneath the professionalism, a tremor that didn't belong. Contact grew faint, bursts of static cut through the channel, and then there was only an indistinct phrase before silence replaced language altogether. Witnesses aboard the Skylark heard the final transmissions fade into nothing, as if swallowed by the water itself. The crew above tried desperately to raise her. Ping after ping sent into the void, each returning unanswered. They waited for hours that stretched into disbelief, hoping for the rhythm of machinery to reappear through the sonar, for some pattern to suggest life. What they heard instead was absence, a flat echo that marked the ocean's refusal to give anything back. When the last attempt failed, it wasn't confirmed as a disaster, only as loss of communication, a phrase that felt easier to hold on to than the truth forming below. Below, pressure gathered with a kind of inevitability. Experts would later suggest that a single silver braze joint failed, allowing water to surge through systems designed to withstand almost everything except imperfection. Once the reactor shut down, propulsion stopped, leaving only the ocean's weight to decide what came next. The Thresher would have descended past crush depth within seconds, her hull imploding under thousands of pounds per square inch. Those who studied the physics later spoke of it not as destruction, but as instantaneous obliteration, a collapse so fast that no one aboard could have registered fear before the end. In the hours that followed the submarine's disappearance, naval bases along the eastern seaboard initiated one of the most intense communication relays in Cold War history. Messages crossed between Portsmouth, Key West, and Washington, each carrying the same restrained urgency, the acknowledgement that a nuclear vessel was missing, and that its reactor posed a potential hazard to the deep. Despite secrecy surrounding nuclear operations, fragments of the event reached civilian radio operators, who reported intercepted bursts of coded traffic long after the Navy had declared radio silence. The public, left without official word, began to speculate about Soviet involvement, sabotage, or experimental weaponry, rumours that would persist long after the first press release sought to contain them. When search vessels finally converged on the coordinates, they found nothing on the surface except drifting slicks of oil. The Navy launched one of its most extensive deep-sea searches, sending down cameras and sonar arrays capable of reaching into the abyss. For months, the Atlantic refused to yield. Only fragments appeared: twisted metal, scattered cables, a torn section of hull, resting on the seafloor some 8,400 feet down, scattered across an area wider than expectation allowed. It wasn't a wreck in the traditional sense, but a disassembled record of what once had form. Fragments of metal told the story no survivor could. Each piece bore a kind of finality. The imploded pressure hull, the shattered periscope, remnants of internal piping warped beyond recognition. The wreckage lay in sections, as though the submarine had folded in on itself before dispersing into the dark. Photographs taken by remote submersibles decades later showed nothing resembling life, only the outlines of machinery turned relic. The Thresher had become part of the seabed, a landscape of human ambition rewritten by pressure and silence. In the years that followed, the Thresher became more than a loss. It became a lesson etched into steel. The tragedy spurred the creation of SubSafe, a program that redefined submarine safety, enforcing rigorous standards on every vessel that would later descend beneath the surface. Through it, the Navy sought to ensure no other crew would vanish in the same manner. Yet for all the reforms and investigations, the exact chain of failure remained elusive, obscured by forces that cannot be reconstructed from debris alone. Archival documents released decades later revealed that, even before its final dive, engineers had expressed quiet concerns about certain joints and welds within the high-pressure piping system. Memos from the shipyard at Portsmouth described testing procedures that had passed official inspection yet failed to account for small imperfections in silver-brazed fittings. Though these details were minor at the time, investigators would later connect them to the catastrophic failure that doomed the submarine. The unearthed correspondence, written in the precise language of naval bureaucracy, reads today like a slow accumulation of warning, each line a reminder of how human confidence can overlook the smallest defect until it becomes irreversible. Amid those improvements, families of the lost men lived with the weight of uncertainty. Many of them received few details beyond the Navy's official statements, which offered closure only in formality. Memorials were built, names engraved, and ceremonies held, yet the event retained an unfinished edge. Survivors from shipyards and support crews spoke of uneasy dreams in the years that followed, of hearing faint mechanical sounds that seemed to echo from deep beneath the waves, long after the world had moved on. Beneath it all lies the unspoken reality that the Thresher was never truly found in the human sense. It remains in darkness. Few have seen it directly, in waters colder than memory, under pressures that erase everything soft or fragile. There is no plaque, no steady light to mark its place, only a distant point on a map, revisited occasionally by machines that do not feel the weight of history. for every technical explanation, there lingers something deeper, something that belongs to the ocean itself, where failures turn into silence and silence into myth. Yet something about the silence surrounding the site refuses to settle. Divers and technicians who have reviewed the sonar recordings speak of anomalies in the data, unexplained pulses that appear at irregular intervals near the wreck site. Whether they are echoes from shifting debris or something else entirely remains unknown. The ocean, after all, is not a place that easily relinquishes its secrets, and even machines built for certainty can end up answering to its hidden laws. The sound of implosion lingers still, somewhere beyond hearing. K-129, 1968, North Pacific Ocean. The first sign that something was wrong came not from the ocean, but from a missing report. A Soviet naval command station in Kamchatka waited for the submarine K-129 to send its scheduled transmission, a brief coded signal confirming that the patrol had reached its northern sector. It never arrived. Hours passed, then a day, and the silence stretched beyond routine delay. At first, it was logged as a technical fault, perhaps a temporary radio malfunction. But when the second transmission window came and went, the absence became more than procedural. It became the first thread of a mystery that would reach across decades and oceans. Routine transmissions from K-129 stopped without warning, breaking a line of communication that had never before failed. The submarine, one of the Soviet Navy's Golf II class ballistic missile boats, carried 3 nuclear missiles and nearly 100 men. She had left Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky in late February 1968, bound for a patrol zone in the North Pacific. The crew, mostly young officers and engineers, knew their mission was sensitive but not unusual, routine deterrence, far from the watchful eyes of American surveillance. Yet somewhere between orders and open water, the ocean swallowed them whole. In the Soviet command network, confusion turned to calculation. The first inquiries were quiet, internal, handled through coded cables between fleet commanders. But by the 5th day, a larger operation began to form. Dozens of vessels were ordered into the North Pacific, their paths intersecting in widening circles. What they sought was simple in theory, a lost submarine. But what they found instead were miles of empty sea and the growing certainty that something catastrophic had occurred. Each hour of searching without discovery deepened the unease. Across the Pacific, American listening stations logged the silence with quiet precision, noting its timing to the second. The United States had built an underwater acoustic monitoring network known as SOSUS, designed to detect submarine movements across the world's oceans. Analysts at Pearl Harbor noticed a peculiar event recorded on March 8th, a low, distant sound signature in the mid-Pacific, consistent with a sudden implosion. Its coordinates lay far from any American patrol route but near where Soviet vessels now searched. It was a connection too compelling to ignore. When seismic sensors in Hawaii registered an unusual pulse, analysts began to suspect that the sea itself had recorded the event. The data suggested a catastrophic failure at depth, an implosion powerful enough to crush steel, rupture compartments, and extinguish all life aboard in an instant. Yet even this analysis was incomplete. The exact coordinates were only approximations, and in the vastness of the Pacific, a margin of error of even a few miles meant the difference between discovery and disappearance. Somewhere below, in the dark, a nuclear submarine lay broken, its reactor and missiles unaccounted for. To Moscow, the loss demanded secrecy. To Washington, it invited opportunity. Officially, both sides maintained silence, each unwilling to acknowledge what they knew. Unofficially, the race began, a contest to locate, identify, and if possible recover what the ocean had taken. The US Navy dispatched reconnaissance flights under unrelated designations, their true mission masked by meteorological or research purposes. Intelligence analysts worked in rooms sealed from daylight, examining the faint acoustic patterns again and again. Somewhere in that noise, they believed, lay the trace of the K-129. Behind closed doors, intelligence officials traced orbits and trajectories, mapping the possible resting place of a nuclear submarine. The operation's code name became whispered rather than spoken. Months passed, and the Soviet search fleet eventually returned home without results. But the United States, through a separate initiative involving the Central Intelligence Agency, began planning something extraordinary, a deep-sea recovery unlike any attempted before. What could not be confirmed through diplomacy or surveillance, they would attempt to raise from the seafloor itself. The operation that followed was not a rescue, but a race beneath the surface of diplomacy. Project Azorian, as it came to be known, was conceived in total secrecy. Its purpose was to retrieve at least part of the K-100-29 from a depth of nearly 16,000 feet, both to recover the nuclear materials and to uncover Soviet technology that had until then remained inaccessible. For years, this plan remained confined to classified briefings, known to only a handful of people. It was not merely a mission of recovery, it was an act of intelligence theatre staged upon the floor of the Pacific. Under the cover of deep-sea mining, engineers built a ship that carried an unspoken purpose. The Hughes Glomar Explorer, publicly announced as a vessel for collecting manganese nodules, concealed within its enormous hull a complex system designed to reach into the abyss and lift an entire submarine. The project's civilian facade was elaborate. Press releases, company charters, and contracts all pointed to oceanic research. Only a small circle knew the truth, that its vast central bay concealed a mechanical claw meant to seize a lost Soviet vessel. The Glomar Explorer sailed with no announcement, its decks crowded with machinery disguised as research equipment. Throughout 1974, under a veil of diplomatic calm, it reached the coordinates determined by sonar analysis. Once in position, it lowered its recovery device, a towering structure of cables, hydraulics, and sensors, into the deep. Days passed as operators watched instruments flicker and stabilize, each number a measure of the descent into blackness. Then, at last, the cameras found it. The shattered hull of K-129 resting on the seabed, tilted at an angle, its forward section almost intact. When cameras finally reached the wreck, they revealed a vessel that seemed more preserved than broken, as if time itself had stalled around it. Silt drifted through the openings like slow-moving snow, coating the remains of consoles and collapsed bulkheads. The red star painted on the bow was faint but visible, a trace of colour beneath the grey monotone of depth. To the engineers watching the feed, the sight was both triumphant and mournful. The operation had reached its target, but what lay before them was a graveyard of steel and memory. Inside, fragments of human life were discovered. Uniforms, papers, and a sealed compartment holding something unidentifiable. Recovery began, but the ocean resisted. As the mechanical arms began lifting the submarine, part of the structure fractured under its own weight. The cables groaned, and a section of the hull broke free, tumbling back into the darkness. Only a portion of the vessel made it to the surface, encased in secrecy. What exactly was recovered has never been fully disclosed. The official explanation lists sections of the forward hull and human remains given military burial, but little more. Official reports ended there, but rumours suggested that part of the recovery failed, leaving pieces behind. Some accounts claimed that one of the K-129's nuclear missiles was retrieved. Others insisted that the payload remained lost. The burial at sea of several recovered sailors was filmed and kept classified for years, later released in fragments, muted images of flags, wreaths, and water closing over the dead. Even in this, the line between truth and symbol blurred. The mission had succeeded enough to prove possible what had once been unthinkable, yet failed enough to remain incomplete. Decades later, declassified files filled in fragments but not the truth. Some documents confirmed the cost and scope of the project, hundreds of millions of dollars, years of planning, and the involvement of thousands of workers who never knew what they were building. Others hinted at the broader implications, that beneath the competition of superpowers lay a strange reverence for what they could not fully control. Both nations, in their own way, treated the wreck as sacred, an artifact of power and silence. Somewhere beneath the coordinates that remain redacted, the K-129 rests as both evidence and silence. The currents continue to move across the seafloor, sweeping over the fractured hull and scattered debris. The sea has long since claimed what belonged to it, yet the site endures as a monument to secrecy, the point where technology, ambition, and mystery converge. Every few years, reports emerge of sonar contacts, acoustic reflections, or rumours of unauthorised dives, each adding another layer to a story that never quite ends. Even in death, It continued to transmit nothing but silence, an unending message from the depths that no one has ever been able to interpret. USS Dorado, 1943, Caribbean Sea. The report began like any other. Typed in steady lines and signed with naval precision, it documented the launch of a new submarine on a mission few expected to be remarkable. USS Dorado, a Gato-class vessel, left the submarine base at New London, Connecticut on October 6, 1943, bound for the Panama Canal. It was her maiden voyage, her crew still adjusting to the rhythm of life beneath steel and pressure. The Atlantic that month was restless but not hostile. Nothing in the forecast suggested that this would be the last time Dorado would ever be seen. USS Dorado had departed New London under the command of Lieutenant Commander E.L. Slayton, carrying 77 men. The orders were simple enough: proceed south to the canal zone, observe radio silence, and report arrival by the 24th. The boat's final messages, sent before entering restricted communication zones, described normal operation and clear weather. A new vessel, fully fueled, equipped, and manned by a competent crew, it should have been a routine transfer. Nothing in her logs hinted at mechanical faults or navigational errors. And yet, as she slipped into the open waters past Key West and down toward the Caribbean, her trail began to vanish. Official logs traced her progress southward, through the chain of command, from submarine headquarters to coastal stations, each expecting her scheduled arrival. When the 24th came and went without signal, her name appeared on dispatches marked overdue, not reported. The first aircraft began its search within days, following calculated drift paths and ocean currents. Navy vessels scoured the approaches to Panama and the waters north of Colombia, but beneath the surface, the Caribbean yielded nothing. No oil slick, no wreckage, not even a floating life jacket. The sea that had been her highway became her vault. Then came the absence. It spread quietly, unrecorded except in the silences between daily communications. Crews aboard other submarines began whispering about the Dorado, a ship too new to vanish, a name now avoided in casual speech. Within days, speculation filled the void that her disappearance left behind. Some suggested enemy action. German U-boats still prowled the Caribbean, operating out of hidden refueling points along the South American coast. Others blamed navigation error or a mine from a recent Allied defensive field. But the evidence remained stubbornly absent, leaving only questions that no one could chart. Confusion may have begun long before the submarine vanished. Declassified navigation charts later revealed that portions of the Caribbean were divided into overlapping zones of control, some used by Allied forces for mine-laying exercises. One restricted area, established shortly before Dorado's departure, was never clearly relayed to all command centres. This bureaucratic tangle meant that her plotted course may have passed directly through a danger zone marked only on certain regional maps. A silent oversight that could have transformed routine travel into disaster. Patrol aircraft later claimed to have seen an unidentified submarine near the Dorado's projected course. One plane, operating from Guantanamo Bay, even dropped depth charges on what it believed to be a hostile target. The pilot reported oil and bubbles, signs of a possible hit. Hours later, confusion took hold when intelligence suggested Dorado had been expected in that same area, perhaps off course due to currents or miscommunication. The possibility that an American bomber had destroyed its own submarine began to spread through classified channels. Official statements dismissed the theory, but none could erase the uncomfortable timeline. But every confirmation carried its own shadow. A captured German logbook decades later revealed that U-boat operations had indeed occurred near Dorado's last known region in mid-October 1943, though none admitted to an attack. The ambiguity thickened further when reports surfaced of a submarine silhouette sighted days after Dorado's presumed loss. Too distant to identify, too brief to verify. Each new lead contradicted the last, creating a map of uncertainty that only widened as the years passed. What began as a search turned into a study of contradiction, where every attempt to explain her end became entangled in the mystery of her absence. During the Cold War, decades after her loss, whispers resurfaced about her possible discovery. Some reports linked deep-sea sonar anomalies off the Yucatan Basin to a secret US operation codenamed Project Azorian, an effort initially intended to recover a Soviet submarine. Naval engineers involved in the mission claimed that an earlier, smaller-scale expedition had stumbled upon a wreck matching Dorado's dimensions. The claims were never acknowledged publicly, and no record survived to confirm whether any such find was ever documented. But the suggestion lingered like a classified echo beneath the waves. Months later, fragments were rumoured off the Colombian coast. Fishermen told of debris washing ashore, bits of metal, lengths of cable, even what one claimed was a section of hull plate. None were ever authenticated, and the Navy quietly archived the reports without confirmation. Families of the crew clung to any mention of discovery, even as official channels fell silent. Memorials were held in the absence of remains. The sea, indifferent and complete, had already claimed its answers. Even now, the records refuse agreement. Some declassified documents insist Dorado was lost due to friendly fire. Others lean toward a drifting mine or undetected structural failure. A few historians point to classified sonar readings taken decades later that hint at a wreck resting deep within the Caribbean basin. Too deep for direct recovery, too faint to confirm. In official Navy histories, her loss is still listed as unknown cause. But among the few who study naval disappearances, Dorado stands apart not for the violence of her end, but for how completely she was erased. For those who still trace her course on faded charts, the coordinates form more than a search grid. They outline a question that no inquiry has ever closed. Somewhere between New London and Panama, 77 men and an entire vessel vanished into a sea calm enough to reflect the sky, yet cold enough to keep its secrets. The Caribbean holds many wrecks, but only one that sailed into silence so absolute it seems designed to remain. In the months following the disappearance, letters addressed to crewmen of the Dorado continue to arrive at the Panama base. Mail, rerouted, unopened, then quietly filed away. Some were marked "Return to Sender." Others were kept in storage until they yellowed and crumbled. A few bore the handwriting of wives and parents who refused to believe in finality, convinced that the men might still surface. Each envelope became its own record of uncertainty, carrying the same question the Navy could never answer. How could a ship so new, so carefully tracked, simply cease to exist? What slipped beneath those calm Caribbean waters was not just a submarine, but a record rewritten by silence itself. HMS Hood, 1941, Denmark Strait, North Atlantic. Dawn light revealed 2 warships tracing arcs through the Denmark Strait. The air above the North Atlantic was bitter and pale, wind-carving patterns across the grey expanse, as 2 fleets, distant yet converging, felt the weight of pursuit. The sea lay cold and metallic beneath them, unyielding as steel. In those hours before engagement, the British and German forces were not yet at war with one another, but with the horizon itself, each searching for the other's outline against an ocean that refused to reveal its secrets. HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, was no ordinary ship. Launched in 1918, she embodied the last breath of one era and the beginning of another. An immense battlecruiser of 860 feet, armed with 8 15-inch guns and the aura of invincibility that came from decades of unchallenged power. To sailors across the Empire, she was the mighty Hood, the symbol of Britain's command of the seas. To her crew of 1,418 men, she was both fortress and home, a moving city of rivets and echoes that carried them across oceans under a banner of certainty. Yet beneath that pride ran an unspoken truth. Hood had never undergone the modernisation promised to her class. Her deck armour, formidable in her youth, was now thin by the standards of 1941, a flaw few discussed aloud. Her reputation preceded her into every ocean she crossed, from Gibraltar to Cape Town, from Alexandria to Scapa Flow. Her arrival drew silent crowds and cautious respect. She was not simply a warship, but a statement of endurance, a vessel that had outlasted an empire's decline. Yet time was an enemy no armour could resist, and as she sailed from Iceland toward the frigid passage of the Denmark Strait, her age showed in small but telling ways. Rivets had begun to strain under pressure, and steel plates carried scars from storms older than her youngest crewmen. Still, when orders came to intercept the German battleship Bismarck, none doubted that Hood would lead the charge. On the morning of May 24, 1941, she met her mirror in steel. The Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen emerged from the mist like twin spectres of iron, their outlines sharp against the low cloud. At 5:52 a.m., the first British shells crossed the water, their thunder rolling through the strait like a storm born from the deep. The Germans returned fire minutes later, their rangefinders exact, their gunners disciplined. Each side fought in partial blindness, flashes of orange light carving temporary truth into the haze. Between the exchange of salvos, the ocean seemed to hold its breath. Observers from the British fleet later recalled a blinding flash that seemed to split the horizon itself. One moment Hood was returning fire, the next a column of flame erupted from her midsection, reaching skyward with unnatural intensity. Witnesses aboard HMS Prince of Wales reported that the fire appeared to rise from within, beneath the aft deck, where ammunition stores were held. Seconds later came a detonation so violent that it broke the ship in two. The forward section lifted clear of the sea, then disappeared beneath it. The stern lingered only moments longer before sliding into the deep. The entire sequence lasted barely 3 minutes. What followed defied every expectation of naval warfare. Ships were not supposed to vanish like that, not under observation, not without warning. The Prince of Wales continued firing, but the crew could only watch in disbelief as the pride of the fleet dissolved into fire and smoke. Debris rained across the water, mingled with oil and splintered steel. When the shock subsided, there was only silence and drifting wreckage. Of the 1,418 men aboard, the sea returned just 3. In the hours after the explosion, only 3 men were found alive, men whose testimonies would become the fragile scaffolding upon which all later theories were built. They spoke of a normal morning, clear orders, steady conditions, and no sign of internal failure before the blast. The survivors had been thrown clear by the explosion, surfacing amid burning debris. One described hearing the sound of secondary detonations beneath the waves. Another remembered a vast cavity of air that seemed to open beneath the ship before she broke apart. None saw the exact cause, only the sudden transformation from ship to silence. As recovery efforts began, the shock across Britain deepened into disbelief. The loss of the Hood struck not just as a military blow, but as an existential wound, a collapse of confidence in the very institution that had guarded the seas for centuries. Newspapers spoke of vengeance, the admiralty of inquiry, but among sailors there was only one question: what could have destroyed her so completely, so instantly? Some blamed the thin deck armour and the trajectory of Bismarck's shells, which struck from a high arc. Others suggested an internal explosion, a spark from a cordite charge igniting a magazine. Both seemed plausible, yet neither could be proven with certainty. Salvage attempts were impossible at the time. The depth of the Denmark Strait, combined with the icy currents, made descent beyond human reach. Naval engineers relied on survivor testimony and trajectory calculations, assembling a theoretical model of how the shell may have penetrated her defences. But every version of the event contained contradictions, a discrepancy in the timing of the flash, an uncertainty about the point of impact, a delay in the fire's spread that should not have existed if the ammunition had detonated instantly. The further they studied, the less certain the answers became. Years passed, and Hood remained where she had fallen, undisturbed, invisible, yet never forgotten. It was not until 2001 that her wreck was finally located, resting nearly 2 miles beneath the surface. The bow lay upright, its outline almost intact, while the stern was scattered across a field of debris. Analysis of the remains supported the theory of an internal magazine explosion, but failed to clarify how it had been triggered. Some sections bore signs of a violent upward blast, while others seemed crushed inward as though struck by pressure rather than force. Even in death, the ship resisted definition. Within the darkness of the deep, time had preserved strange details. A section of the mast still upright, a single brass fitting gleaming faintly under artificial light, the shadow of the hull carved into silt. The site became both a memorial and a puzzle, a place where history seemed suspended between evidence and imagination. Engineers, historians, and divers each saw in the wreck what they needed to believe: a symbol, a mystery, or a mechanical inevitability. Yet none could reconcile the precision of naval engineering with the chaos that consumed her. Investigations would stretch across decades, each seeking a different truth. Some pointed to unstable propellant batches loaded during her last refit, others to a flawed flash-proofing system meant to isolate gun turrets from magazines. A few insisted on an alternative theory, that a shell detonated below the armour belt near a vulnerable joint between compartments, causing structural failure that cascaded through the hull. But each hypothesis raised new questions. Why was there only one explosion? Why did the forward turrets continue firing until the instant of detonation? Why did the crew report no alarms? The more the evidence was examined, the more it seemed to fade into ambiguity, as though the ocean itself refused to give a coherent account. Decades after the war, the Hood still commands reverence among sailors. Her name is carved into memorials from Portsmouth to Halifax, and every May wreaths are laid in her memory. But for those who study naval history, her story remains an enigma, a battle witnessed by hundreds, recorded by instruments, and yet still obscured by mystery. The line between what was seen and what truly happened has never fully closed. In the flicker of that explosion lies something that no report or photograph can capture. A moment when the known world tore open and knowledge itself was swallowed by fire. Even under the brightest scrutiny, the Hood's final moment remains a fragment of light swallowed by the sea. K-141 Kursk, 2000, Barents Sea, Arctic Ocean. Steel hummed softly in the depths, a rhythm of systems too confident to fail. Inside the corridors of the Russian submarine K-141 Kursk, machinery thrummed with precision, 1,000 gauges marking order beneath the freezing surface of the Barents Sea. It was August 12th, 2000, and the Northern Fleet was conducting a large-scale naval exercise, the first of its kind in years, intended to demonstrate the strength of a resurgent navy. To those aboard, it was another operation, disciplined and routine, carried out in the cold shadow of decades of secrecy and pride. K-141 Kursk carried the weight of pride and secrecy, its mission sealed beneath layers of command silence. Measuring over 150 meters, the Oscar II-class submarine was designed to strike with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, one of the most formidable vessels ever produced by the Soviet legacy. Each man aboard, from the young conscripts to Captain Gennady Lyachin himself, understood the honour and the risk of commanding such power. Yet that same power, when combined with age, corrosion and secrecy, could turn from weapon to coffin in the span of seconds. At first the drills unfolded flawlessly, compartments checked, coordinates locked, every sound accounted for. The submarine descended smoothly beneath the surface, taking its place among the fleet for a mock torpedo exercise. In the control room, voices were measured, calm, their movements choreographed by long experience. Outside, water pressed evenly against the hull, steady as breath. For those inside, the hum of engines and the pulse of systems were reassuring, a mechanical certainty in an uncertain sea. Then the ocean answered back with a noise no one could name. At 11:28 a.m, seismographs in Norway and northern Russia registered a sudden tremor, small, sharp, and out of rhythm with any known undersea pattern. 40 seconds later came another, far stronger equivalent to several tons of TNT. On the surface, Russian ships waited for a signal that would never arrive. The Kursk had gone silent, its systems vanishing from sonar as if erased mid-breath. Above the Barents Sea, ships turned their antennas toward an absence they could not interpret. Initial reports claimed communications trouble, then power failure, then nothing at all. The fleet remained in position, unwilling to acknowledge what had likely already occurred. Only hours later did search vessels begin sweeping the area, their sonar pings crossing the cold water like questions cast into a void. No one aboard the Kursk responded. Hours stretched into disbelief as officials debated whether the explosion was internal or imagined. Moscow issued statements of composure, assuring families and the press alike that contact would be restored. But Naval Command struggled with another truth. The fleet had detected the shockwave, and its magnitude suggested something catastrophic within the submarine's own torpedo compartment. While leaders weighed responses, men below the surface, those who had survived the initial blast, waited in the dark for help that would come too late. Divers who descended later described a silence so complete it felt manufactured. The submarine lay 108 meters below, listing slightly to one side, its hull partially crushed. Attempts to open the escape hatches were met with stubborn resistance. Pressure and debris sealed every possible point of entry. Through small camera probes, they glimpsed devastation. Mangled equipment, burned metal, and a trail of evidence leading back to a torpedo that may have detonated prematurely. Yet even then, many questioned how one weapon could bring down such a massive craft, one built specifically to endure near-apocalyptic force. The wreck revealed not just failure, but something stranger, evidence rearranged, as if rewritten by the pressure itself. Investigators later claimed that hydrogen peroxide from a faulty torpedo had leaked, causing a chain reaction. But competing reports suggested an external impact, perhaps another vessel's involvement, one quickly denied by every navy in the region. Some fragments recovered from the hull showed marks inconsistent with internal detonation, leading to suspicions that the explosion had been more complex than admitted. As rescue efforts faltered, the tragedy deepened into silence. The first divers from Britain and Norway were not allowed to assist for days, their offers delayed by political hesitation. When access was finally granted, nearly all 118 men aboard were long dead. In the aft compartments, search teams found bodies clustered together, evidence that a handful had survived for hours after the explosions. A letter recovered from Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov listed the names of those still alive beside him, noting the fading oxygen and spreading fire. It was dated several hours after the submarine vanished from contact. Each year carried the same unanswered echo, a reminder that some explanations are not meant to be found. Official investigations repeated the same controlled phrases: equipment malfunction, training accident, mechanical failure. Yet each attempt to simplify the cause revealed only further contradictions. Recovered debris showed uneven damage patterns, audio logs hinted at additional detonations, and the secrecy surrounding the early rescue attempts led many to believe that more had been hidden than revealed. Acoustic records from foreign naval stations later confirmed that the two explosions were detected across vast distances, their echoes traced by American, British, and Norwegian monitoring arrays. Analysts noted a peculiar delay between the detonations, suggesting an initial malfunction followed by a far larger secondary blast, yet the precise chemical sequence remained elusive. Declassified reports hinted that the United States had gathered detailed acoustic and thermal readings within minutes of the disaster, but the information was never fully shared. To some investigators, this pattern of withheld data only deepened suspicion that multiple nations knew more about the Kursk's final moments than they ever admitted. Political tensions only deepened the mystery. The Russian government, reluctant to expose weaknesses in its fleet, released minimal details about the sequence of events. International observers questioned the slow response time and the decision to decline immediate foreign aid. When the submarine was finally raised from the seabed a year later, much of the evidence had already deteriorated, corroded by time and salt. The exact cause of the explosions remained uncertain, preserved only in fragments of twisted steel. Within naval circles, the disaster marked a turning point, a symbol of decline as much as loss. The Kursk had been a monument to technological endurance, but its destruction revealed fragility where confidence once stood. The men aboard were trained to operate machines of near-mythic resilience, yet found themselves undone by something no system could predict or repair. In the wreck's recovered compartments, personal items remained untouched. Letters, photographs, and notes addressed to families waiting on shore. They told a quieter story than any official record could. Rumours of collision persisted, pointing toward the possibility that a foreign submarine, perhaps American or British, had been shadowing the exercise and struck the Kursk by mistake. Such claims were denied outright, though unexplained sonar traces were logged near the time of the explosion. Conspiracy theories grew in the absence of closure, amplified by secrecy and nationalism. But whether accident, sabotage, or error, the truth had already settled where no diver could retrieve it. As the wreck was finally dismantled, engineers observed strange signs of collapse. The steel bent inward as though crushed by unseen pressure. Some pieces were quietly removed and never seen again. To this day, fragments of the submarine remain classified, locked within facilities along the Murmansk coast. The tragedy became a lesson in containment, of evidence of accountability, of memory. Down where the light fades, the sea claimed its due, swallowing what no machinery could defend. Currents carried fine sediment through the corridors, settling over control panels and journals alike. Fish moved through open hatches where men once stood watch. The Kursk became a monument to the limits of precision, how technology built for dominance could so easily be swallowed by what it sought to master. Time has turned those last transmissions into fragments, their meanings corroded by politics and salt. What once were signals of distress are now background noise in an archive of the unspoken. The sea keeps its own records, unread, unaltered, and endless. What rests beneath the Barents Sea is not merely a lost submarine, but a question buried too deep for truth to rise again. HMS Sydney, 1941 Indian Ocean. Far from sight, beyond the usual shipping lanes that trace the Western Australian coast, the Indian Ocean stretched in calm indifference. HMS Sydney, a light cruiser returning from escort duty, moved steadily through open waters, her crew unaware that the horizon concealed another presence. The sea was deceptively still that evening, flat and almost metallic under a dimming sky, when a shape appeared in the distance, flying the colours of a Dutch merchant vessel. Signals exchanged between the two ships seemed routine, polite even, yet something in the false civility of that moment would later define one of the most haunting maritime disappearances of the Second World War. Without warning, the illusion fractured. The supposed merchantman was no ally but the German auxiliary cruiser Cormoran, disguised under false flags and neutral markings. As Sydney closed the distance to question her, Cormoran's concealed guns turned outward, and a sudden blaze of artillery ripped through the dusk. Within minutes the ocean erupted in light and sound, a short, brutal exchange that left both ships fatally wounded. Witnesses on Cormoran's lifeboats would later describe Sydney ablaze from bow to stern, her guns silent, her silhouette fading into darkness, until only the reflection of her burning hull marked her place in the sea. Through the smoke's dark haze, the ocean glowed with fading bursts, the thunder of each detonation swallowed by distance. Survivors from Cormoran later spoke of watching Sydney drift, her searchlights still faintly cutting through the haze before winking out one by one. The smell of burning oil carried across the waves, mingling with silence so complete it seemed unnatural. Even hardened sailors recalled the eerie calm that followed, as if the ocean itself were absorbing the violence it had just witnessed. What began as recognition soon shifted into something more desperate and strange. The battle, lasting barely half an hour, ended without radio distress, without recovery, without witnesses beyond the enemy crew. The Indian Ocean swallowed the cruiser entirely. No bodies, no survivors, no debris reached the coast. It was as though an entire warship and 645 men had been quietly erased. The last confirmed sighting placed Sydney burning on the horizon. By morning, the ocean was empty again, the only remnants drifting unseen below. In the following hours, search vessels scoured vast expanses of open water, guided by coordinates that led nowhere. Oil slicks were reported, but none were confirmed. The survivors of Cormoran, rescued days later, spoke of seeing Sydney list to one side before vanishing beyond sight, but their testimony carried inconsistencies that troubled investigators. Why had Sydney approached so close to an unidentified vessel? Why had no signal of distress or engagement been sent? The questions deepened as time stretched on, and every unanswered call to the sea felt heavier than the last. As the search dragged on, coastal stations reported conflicting sightings, flares seen from distant trawlers, debris that turned out to be driftwood, and shadows mistaken for lifeboats in the half-light of dawn. Radio operators working through the night described phantom transmissions, bursts of static that resembled fragments of coded signals before vanishing mid-sequence. The uncertainty began to wear on the crews sent to look for her. Each failed sweep carved deeper into the conviction that the ocean had claimed everything, leaving only confusion in its wake. Over the next several days, reconnaissance aircraft from the Royal Australian Air Force traced grid after grid across the sea, their crews reporting faint shapes beneath the surface that dissolved before they could be verified. Naval commands in Perth and Fremantle scrambled to interpret radio fragments that hinted at distress signals, though none could be traced to Sydney. Merchant vessels along the coast were instructed to remain vigilant for debris, but they found only stretches of undisturbed water, reflecting a sky as blank as the unanswered transmissions that had filled it. Reports that trickled in days later did little to soothe the silence. Fragments of wreckage washed ashore along the coast, charred planks, lifebelts, an officer's cap, but no trace of the crew. Some believed the cruiser had continued burning through the night before finally sinking, her remains scattered across the seabed. Others speculated she might have drifted further than recorded, pulled by unseen currents toward a different resting place. The Australian Navy's inquiries grew more uncertain the longer they searched, and with each passing week Sydney's fate became less a question of warfare and more a matter of haunting absence. Tragedy became legend, and decades of silence transformed Sydney's disappearance into a national enigma. Families of the crew gathered yearly along the coast, staring toward the horizon as if waiting for a ship still on its way home. Naval historians debated protocols and signals, arguing whether outdated engagement rules had sealed the cruiser's fate. Each theory added another layer of distance, as though the more the story was studied, the further the truth retreated beneath the weight of remembrance. When the wreck was finally located, 66 years later in 2008, nearly 150 miles off Shark Bay, it lay eerily intact. The hull bore wounds that matched Cormoran's account, direct hits to the bridge, the forward turrets destroyed, but still the findings raised doubts. The distance between the two wrecks was greater than expected, as if Sydney had continued moving long after she should have been crippled. The remains of her crew rested silently within the fractured metal, their positions suggesting they had fought to the very end. Even with the evidence laid bare on the seafloor, the manner of her disappearance, its quiet, total completeness, remained a riddle of timing and intent. Marine archaeologists who surveyed the site noted that Sydney's lifeboats had been torn from their davits, scattered in directions inconsistent with normal sinking behaviour. Internal evidence suggested the crew had attempted damage control long after communication ceased, sealing compartments in vain to slow the flooding. Forensic examinations of the hull plating revealed signs of secondary explosions, possibly from ammunition ignited below deck, though no conclusive sequence could be drawn. The sea, in its vast indifference, had rearranged the evidence just enough to keep the truth incomplete. Questions still hover over what truly occurred that evening. Was it a lapse in judgment, an act of calculated deception, or something else, a chain of errors too perfect to explain? The ocean keeps its composure, concealing both the truth and the final moments of those lost within it. Every discovery since has only reinforced the sense that Sydney did not simply sink. She was taken by the same inscrutable stillness that claimed her silence from the start. Under the vast cold waters of the Indian Ocean, the echo of the final signal persists, unanswered and haunting. USS Scorpion, 1968, Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic stretched without boundary, a seemingly infinite expanse of dark water that shifted only subtly with the currents, while USS Scorpion, a sleek nuclear submarine, moved silently beneath the waves, its hull cutting through the deep with almost imperceptible motion. The crew operated within routines honed by countless patrols, their senses tuned to the hum of machinery, the faint echo of sonar, and the subtle creaks of the steel that enclosed them. Outside, the ocean's vastness offered no warnings, no hints, yet within the confines of the submarine, minor anomalies began to register on instruments that normally spoke only in steady patterns, hinting at disturbances that would never be fully explained. Mechanical hums and subtle vibrations persisted longer than usual, whispers of the vessel's nuclear heart adjusting to the immense pressures far beneath the surface. Logs noted an increase in minor system warnings that had previously gone unnoticed, from fluctuating coolant readings to electrical irregularities that appeared intermittently. Officers and engineers double-checked every gauge, every valve, yet found nothing that could account for the irregularities. These quiet, almost imperceptible disruptions suggested a problem the crew could neither predict nor prevent. A problem that would later become part of the enduring enigma surrounding the Scorpion. Even within the reactor compartments, small irregularities hinted at hidden strain. Technicians later noted micro-fluctuations in coolant flow and transient spikes in neutron readings that were recorded but never triggered alarms. These anomalies were brief and sporadic, barely perceptible against the background of constant operational noise, yet they suggested that the reactor was responding to conditions not fully understood. Combined with the subtle vibrations and electrical quirks observed elsewhere, they formed a mosaic of disturbances that hinted at unseen forces acting upon the vessel. While no single reading foretold catastrophe, In retrospect, they mark the beginning of a chain of events that would remain partially inscrutable even after the wreck was located. Even routine drills began to feel different that day, as if the submarine itself were resisting the crew's commands. Sensors flickered momentarily, lights dimmed without explanation, and the hum of auxiliary pumps carried subtle distortions. Officers reviewed system logs again and again, finding nothing conclusive, yet unease grew among those stationed in the engine and control rooms. Small errors, unnoticed in most patrols, seemed magnified here, as though the Atlantic itself conspired to mask what was coming. Signals that never arrived haunted naval headquarters after Scorpion failed to report on schedule. Initial attempts to communicate with the submarine were met with silence, brief static, or faint echoes of signals that dissipated before confirmation. Commanders ordered search patterns to be initiated immediately, but the vastness of the North Atlantic rendered early efforts almost symbolic. Ships traced grid after grid across the open ocean, aircraft traced shadows on waves, and sonar sweeps sought any trace of the submarine's passage. Yet the Atlantic appeared untouched by the vessel that had vanished so suddenly, leaving only uncertainty in its wake. As days passed, the theories multiplied, each trying to explain the absence of wreckage or survivors. Some suggested mechanical failure compounded by extreme depth pressure. Others speculated about internal explosions triggered by unknown causes. The crew's final movements were inferred only from the scant signals that had briefly reached command before silence fell. No distress call had been fully transmitted, no beacon had been confirmed, and yet the submarine's disappearance carried implications far beyond the loss of its complement, raising questions about nuclear safety, undersea conditions, and the unforgiving nature of the deep. Merchant ships in the patrol area reported seeing fleeting shadows below the surface, brief disturbances in the water that vanished before identification. Some aircraft recorded sonar anomalies inconsistent with normal ocean floor formations, sparking debates in naval command over whether these were fragments, echoes, or illusions caused by the currents. Every lead was pursued and then discarded, leaving searchers with a growing sense of helplessness, as though the Atlantic itself had swallowed the vessel without leaving a trace for human instruments to capture. Search teams combed an area stretching hundreds of miles, following every lead, every report from passing vessels or drifting debris, yet found nothing definitive. Some faint anomalies recorded by sonar suggested fragments or irregularities on the seafloor, but none were immediately verifiable. Weather patterns, ocean currents, and the sheer depth at which Scorpion had been operating complicated every attempt at confirmation. Each day of fruitless searching reinforced the sense that the Atlantic had claimed the submarine in a manner that rendered conventional investigation almost impossible, leaving the crew's fate suspended in a tension that refused resolution. When the wreck was finally located in 1969, resting at a depth of more than 9,800 feet, the evidence provided both answers and fresh questions. The hull was broken into sections, the interior crushed under immense pressure, yet certain areas appeared relatively intact, suggesting the vessel had descended rapidly but not uniformly. Investigators noted damage patterns inconsistent with a single cause, sparking debate over whether the final moments involved a catastrophic internal failure, an implosion, or a combination of factors that the instruments and logs could never capture. The Atlantic had preserved the truth while simultaneously obscuring it, leaving fragments of certainty embedded in the unyielding seabed. Detailed examination of the control room and crew stations revealed that many instruments had been left in operational mode, suggesting attempts to stabilize the submarine even as catastrophic conditions developed. Evidence of emergency measures, sealed compartments, activated pressure valves, and recorded reactor adjustments pointed to a disciplined response in the final moments. Yet the final sequence of events remains impossible to reconstruct fully, leaving open questions about timing, depth, and whether external factors such as ocean currents or underwater obstacles contributed to the submarine's ultimate fate. Examinations of the hull revealed traces of unusual stresses on specific bulkheads, indications that certain systems had remained active longer than anticipated during the descent. Engineering reports post-recovery documented anomalies in pressure chambers and the nuclear reactor that hinted at human attempts to regain control, even as circumstances deteriorated. The silence of the crew, preserved in photographs and the positions of their stations, spoke of disciplined effort in the face of unrecorded terror, a dedication that would remain part of the mystery. Historians and naval engineers alike continue to ponder these details, weighing the evidence without ever concluding, acknowledging that the Atlantic had kept its deepest secret. Speculation persists among experts, not only about technical failure but also about operational decisions, navigational hazards, and the interplay of oceanic conditions that may have contributed to the loss. Comparisons with other submarine incidents highlight the narrow margins between normal operation and disaster at such extreme depths. Debates continue over whether more could have been done to prevent the tragedy or whether it was an unavoidable consequence of technology, environment, and the immutable laws of physics. Even decades later, Scorpion's disappearance serves as a sobering reminder of the ocean's capacity to withhold answers indefinitely. Salvage and sonar reveal only emptiness. The Scorpion story remains submerged, her signal forever beyond detection. USS Indianapolis, 1945, Philippine Sea, Pacific Ocean. The USS Indianapolis had carried its deadly cargo across the vast Pacific with a routine that belied the significance of its mission. The heavy cruiser, commissioned in 1932, had seen action from the early days of the war, and her crew moved with the practiced ease of men who had learned to navigate danger both above and below the waves. By late July 1945, the ship had completed a secret delivery, ferrying components essential to the atomic bomb that would soon fall on Hiroshima. Few aboard fully comprehended the magnitude of their role, and fewer still realized how quickly the ocean itself would become an instrument of their trial. The Indianapolis steamed alone through the Philippine Sea, its decks buzzing with routine maintenance, letters home, and the occasional laughter that punctuated long stretches of monotonous travel. Yet, in the shadow of history, the Pacific seemed to hold its breath. The night was unusually clear, the moon reflecting off the gentle swell, when enemy torpedoes struck without warning. 2 hits, one forward and one aft, ripped through the cruiser's hull with devastating efficiency. Steel screamed as compartments flooded, and the ship listed at impossible angles, leaving men clinging to ladders, rails, and each other in a frantic scramble. Within minutes, the Indianapolis had begun a slow, inexorable slide toward the depths, the sounds of water smashing into bulkheads mingling with cries of disbelief and panic. Some crew members, thrown clear by the explosions, found themselves in the open ocean, the warmth of the tropical night offering no comfort against the encroaching terror of exposure, shock, and predatory sharks that were soon drawn by the scent of chaos. Survivors recalled a surreal suspension of time in the aftermath of the sinking. The cruiser's lifeboats had been destroyed or rendered unusable by the explosion. Those who remained afloat clung to life jackets, rafts fashioned from wreckage, and any debris that could bear weight. Communication was non-existent. Distress signals had either failed or gone unnoticed. Days in the open water became a battle against both physical exhaustion and the creeping erosion of hope. Men drifted in small clusters, some too stunned to call out, others hurling themselves into the sea to pull companions to safety or pull themselves from despair. The Philippine Sea, normally a benign expanse, transformed into a theatre of unrelenting torment. The prolonged silence that followed the sinking has been described by survivors as almost unreal. The Navy, unaware of the ship's peril, assumed the Indianapolis had completed its mission and would soon report. The ship had been travelling alone, and the secrecy surrounding its cargo meant that even routine tracking and escort were absent. This combination of isolation and bureaucratic assumption would prove fatal. For 4 long days, survivors floated amidst the wreckage, many succumbing not to the immediate violence of the sinking but to dehydration, saltwater poisoning, exposure to the sun, and the relentless attacks of sharks. Accounts describe water turning red in patches around the men, screams carried on the wind, and an eerie quiet descending between moments of frantic struggle. Amidst the chaos, individual acts of courage and desperation emerged. Sailors improvised signals, attempted to form rafts from whatever debris remained, and shared meagre supplies of food and water. Some used belts, canvas, and lifelines to create makeshift shelters against the sun's merciless glare. Others, weakened and delirious, drifted alone, sometimes too exhausted to maintain a grip on floating wreckage. The ocean, indifferent and infinite, reshaped the human struggle into a slow, grinding test of endurance. Sharks prowled with increasing boldness as days passed, and survivors recounted horrifying scenes of attacks that could not be averted. They relied on vigilance, instinct, and the solidarity of those near them, yet the numbers dwindled relentlessly. Historians have noted that the Indianapolis disaster remains unique not merely for the sinking itself, but for the human ordeal that followed. The Navy's delayed awareness meant that rescue operations were not mobilized until a routine patrol aircraft noticed men floating far off their intended route. By then, only a fraction of the original crew remained alive. Contemporary reports and later accounts describe the haunting sight of survivors being lifted aboard rescue vessels after days in open water, their bodies sunburned, salt-encrusted and emaciated, eyes glazed with shock and fatigue. Medical teams struggled to treat severe saltwater ingestion, exposure, hypothermia from night chills, and injuries from both the sinking and subsequent shark attacks. Many men never spoke of what they endured, their silence a reflection of trauma too profound for words. The secrecy surrounding the ship's final mission contributed to the confusion. Indianapolis had delivered parts for the atomic bomb, information classified at the highest levels, and this secrecy created a void in reporting, leaving families unaware of the ship's fate. Letters that were never sent, telegrams that carried partial news, and fragmented communication contributed to a sense of disbelief that would linger for decades. Survivors' testimony often conflicted with official records, which struggled to reconcile the enormity of human suffering with the dry, procedural language of military reports. Each account of the disaster contained variations. Some highlighted the courage of individual sailors, others focused on the relentless terror of drifting in shark-infested waters, but together they painted an almost unimaginable picture of survival against overwhelming odds. Psychological scars proved as deep as the physical ones. Survivors spoke of recurring nightmares in which the ocean returned in moments of calm, hiding lurking predators and unclaimed debris. Some refused to swim, while others avoided even the sight of water for years. The trauma was compounded by the abruptness of the event. The Indianapolis had moved from routine operations to catastrophe in minutes, leaving men unable to process what they had endured until years later. Researchers who interviewed survivors noted the recurring motif of isolation, not just in the open water, but in the sense that no one truly understood what had happened until decades after the fact. The Navy conducted several inquiries after the sinking, revealing a mixture of miscommunication, procedural failures, and unfortunate timing. Questions remain about why the ship was unescorted, why distress calls went unnoticed, and how the tragic sequence of events might have been mitigated. The subsequent investigations sought accountability, yet the complexity of wartime operations, combined with the classified nature of Indianapolis's mission, made definitive conclusions elusive. Records suggest that even after the disaster, some documentation was intentionally vague or incomplete, perhaps in part to protect the secrecy of the atomic program, further entangling the ship's final story with mystery. Over the decades, historians and researchers have revisited the Indianapolis incident, not merely as a wartime tragedy, but as a study in the fragility of human survival and institutional oversight. The ship herself remains a ghostly symbol, her wreck located years later in the Philippine Sea, her hull a silent testament to the force of water, fire, and human error. Artifacts recovered from the site, personal effects, fragments of life jackets, and sections of the hull tell stories that official reports never could, giving shape to the otherwise ineffable suffering of those who floated for days under the sun and the stars. Scholars continue to analyse these remains, searching for clues that might explain both the rapidity of the sinking and the extended ordeal that followed. In personal letters and memoirs, survivors often described the strange beauty of the Philippine Sea juxtaposed with horror, the colour of the water under the morning sun, the shifting clouds at dusk, and the quiet, endless expanse that seemed almost indifferent to human presence. Some noted that the ocean itself seemed to have a consciousness, an invisible awareness of their plight, while others insisted that only the sheer randomness of survival dictated who lived and who perished. These recollections form a tapestry of memory that blends fear, awe, and unanswerable questions, leaving each observer with a lingering sense of the unknown. The Indianapolis disaster resonates not only for its immediate devastation, but for its emblematic representation of wartime secrecy and human endurance. The ship's name has become synonymous with courage, tested against impossible odds, a cautionary tale of how isolation, delayed communication, and the capricious nature of the sea can amplify tragedy. Across years of scholarship and storytelling, the disaster remains difficult to fully comprehend. It resists reduction to numbers or charts, instead existing as an enduring human story, a testament to the men who survived and a silent tribute to those who did not. The fate of the Indianapolis and her crew reminds us that, even in the vast, unfeeling expanse of the ocean, the consequences of secrecy, miscommunication, and sheer misfortune can unfold in the most profound and tragic ways. Its story has been retold countless times, yet each recounting carries new reflections on human vulnerability, the mercilessness of nature, and the haunting presence of what lies beneath the surface. Survivors' accounts, official inquiries, and modern examinations converge to form a narrative that is as compelling as it is unsettling, a chapter of naval history in which the silence of the deep is almost as consequential as the violence above it. Lonely in the cold expanse of the Philippine Sea, the cries and struggles of those days drift still, a memory that no rescue, no record, and no passing of years can entirely erase. HNLMS De Ruyter, 1942, Java Sea, Indonesia. Amidst the archipelago's scattered islets, the Dutch naval fleet navigated waters that had long been the crossroads of commerce, colonial ambition, and conflict. In early 1942, the Netherlands East Indies teetered under the shadow of Japanese expansion, and each ship was both a shield and a potential lure for disaster. The HNLMS De Ruyter, a light cruiser named after the famed 17th century admiral, had been thrust into a battle that would define the region's fate. Her decks gleamed with readiness, her guns primed, and her crew trained for engagements that could erupt without warning in the narrow straits and hidden channels between Java, Sumatra, and Borneo. Even amidst preparations, a sense of unease lingered, though none could articulate why the waters themselves seemed to shift with a quiet menace. Evidence from naval intelligence suggested that Japanese forces were already maneuvering with meticulous precision. Reconnaissance sightings and intercepted signals indicated the presence of a formidable invasion fleet. Yet much of the information was contradictory, fragmentary, or delayed, leaving commanders to weigh incomplete data while plotting courses through a labyrinth of islands and reefs. De Ruyter's officers, acutely aware of the stakes, moved through calculations and tactical debates, striving to balance caution with the imperative to engage. Every decision carried weight, and each command rippled through the crew, subtly altering movements, rotations, and expectations in ways they would only fully understand when confronted with the consequences. The cruiser itself had been designed for speed and versatility, a vessel capable of both offense and reconnaissance, yet its limitations became apparent as the battle approached. Japanese records later described concentrated attacks on Dutch formations, and while some accounts emphasized overwhelming force, Dutch documentation suggested confusion and missed opportunities. The interplay between design, tactical intent, and the fog of war created conditions in which a ship could find itself imperiled by factors both visible and unseen. Each gun turret, radar post, and communication line carried the potential to influence life and death, yet the true impact often remained obscured until hours or decades later. In the haze of early morning, as the fleet approached the Java Sea, visibility fluctuated with mist and sun glinting off the water. Officers peered through binoculars, while signalmen relayed the latest orders across tense decks. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese forces were positioning themselves, yet the fleet could not discern the exact composition or intent of the approaching armada. This uncertainty cast a shadow over the crew's routines, turning mundane activities, inspection, drills, even the preparation of meals, into undertakings conducted under a silent, shared awareness that catastrophe could arrive without warning. The interplay of anticipation and fear shaped the crew's every movement, a quiet rhythm underpinned by nerves strung taut across steel and water. Japanese logs later described a concentrated engagement that struck Dutch forces with devastating efficiency. Shells tore through light cruisers and destroyers, while confusion compounded the chaos. Yet the Dutch reports often contradicted these accounts, leaving historians to puzzle over the sequence of events. Signals that were supposedly received never appeared in official logs, Maneuvers described in Japanese documents could not be reconciled with survivor testimonies, and the exact timing of strikes remained unclear. This discrepancy fed the suspicion that either miscommunication or deliberate obfuscation had altered the historical record, leaving the final moments of De Ruyter shrouded in layers of uncertainty. Orders transmitted from Batavia carried urgency, yet the clarity of command seemed to fracture under pressure. Captains and admirals relied on assumptions and prior doctrine, yet reality on the water rarely adhered to expectations. Conflicting interpretations of instructions, compounded by rapidly shifting circumstances, meant that even a single misstep could become fatal. The crew, trained to execute commands swiftly, often found themselves adjusting to evolving directives, while officers sought to interpret intentions through the partial lens of reports, flags, and radio messages that may never have reached their intended recipients in time. Dutch survivors later recounted moments of disorientation and panic as explosions rocked the ship. While some tried to maintain formation and return fire, others grappled with the sudden flooding of compartments and the chaos of a vessel twisting under enemy impact. The accounts diverged. Some emphasized precise attacks by enemy fire, while others suggested that friendly error or a mechanical failure contributed to the rapid sinking. Memory, shock, and the chaos of battle made it nearly impossible to reconstruct events with certainty, ensuring that the precise mechanics of the tragedy remain a source of debate to this day. At the bridge, officers debated the next move while the ship listed dangerously. Navigation charts became tools for survival as much as strategy, and each decision was weighed against both immediate danger and long-term consequences. Crew members below deck could only follow orders, often unaware of how close the vessel teetered on the edge of destruction. The tension was palpable, not just in the sounds of battle, but in the silent calculations and unspoken questions that threaded through every level of the ship. Fear was present, but it was tempered by duty, discipline, and the hazy understanding that the sea itself could turn as lethal as any enemy gun. Echoes of cannon fire lingered long after the initial exchange, carried across water that reflected both sunlight and smoke. The clash of steel and the roar of explosions became a rhythm for which the crew had no reference point, a disorienting cadence in which time stretched and compressed unpredictably. Sailors reported the deafening proximity of shells, yet some claimed to hear the distant, almost ceremonial silence of other vessels being struck, a haunting juxtaposition of violence and emptiness that lent an eerie quality to the battle. The Java Sea, normally placid, was transformed into a liminal space, a domain in which the line between order and catastrophe dissolved. Historians examining the battle note the persistence of contradictions in every primary source. Japanese accounts emphasize tactical superiority, yet Dutch records highlight missed opportunities, errors in judgment, and the apparent absence of coordinated defense. Modern researchers, attempting to reconcile the two, suggest that unknown factors may have influenced outcomes. Perhaps misinterpreted orders, delayed signals, or even deliberate concealment of operational failures. Each possibility introduces new layers of ambiguity, leaving the final hours of HNLMS De Ruyter suspended between fact and speculation. Radar and reconnaissance offered little clarity during the engagement. Despite technological advancements for the era, equipment failed to provide a complete picture of the enemy's approach. Shadows on the horizon, sudden maneuvers, and conflicting signals created an environment in which even experienced officers could not confidently assess risk. This uncertainty amplified the stakes of every choice, and compounded the sense that the ocean itself could hide lethal surprises, shifting the battle from a contest of strategy to a test of perception and judgment under extreme duress. Signals intercepted hinted at intentions that may never have existed. Communications that were later recorded could be read as orders, warnings, or even misdirections, but at the time, they were fragmented and subject to interpretation. The crew's response, calibrated to partial knowledge, intersected with enemy action in ways that produced catastrophic outcomes. Over decades, analysts have debated whether alternate interpretations of these signals could have altered history, but the lack of conclusive evidence ensures that the questions remain open, a testament to the chaotic interplay of chance, human decision, and incomplete information. By nightfall, confusion had spread throughout the fleet. Smoke and fire obscured positions, and the De Ruyter, caught in cross-currents of both physical and informational turbulence, suffered critical damage. Reports diverge on the exact mechanisms of her sinking, with some suggesting direct hits, others structural failure, and yet others pointing to a combination of factors. Survivors were few, and those who did escape the immediate catastrophe often carried with them only fragments of what had occurred, stories that hinted at heroism, error, and a pervasive sense of the inexplicable. The sea around Java remained a silent witness to the unfolding tragedy. Over the years, divers and historians have attempted to piece together the final moments of the cruiser, yet every expedition encounters both physical and documentary gaps. Wreckage, partially recovered or studied remotely, tells a story of sudden descent and violent impact, yet cannot resolve the lingering questions about command decisions, enemy movements, and the precise sequence of events. The mystery of HNLMS De Ruyter endures, an enigmatic chapter of naval history that challenges assumptions and resists finality. Years down the line, inquiries would question whether the disaster had been compounded by hidden orders or deliberate omissions, yet conclusive answers have remained elusive. Some suggest that sensitive wartime directives were intentionally obscured, others that errors were inadvertently amplified by communication failures. The combination of secrecy, conflict, and chaos leaves the final hours of HNLMS De Ruyter suspended in uncertainty, a reminder that even in well-documented history, some truths may remain forever inaccessible. The waters of the Java Sea still conceal the story of a ship whose final voyage was witnessed by few and understood by fewer. ARA San Juan, 2017, South Atlantic Ocean. Flickers of light danced across the control panel, momentarily illuminating the confined spaces of the submarine. Each glow reflected off metal walls, creating fleeting shadows that seemed to stretch longer than the vessel itself. Within the narrow corridors, the hum of machinery underscored routine checks, punctuated by the occasional clatter of tools or the soft footsteps of sailors on duty. The atmosphere was ordinary, almost banal, yet it contained the weight of unseen tension, an imperceptible pressure that could not be quantified but was felt by everyone aboard. The vessel carried with it the expectation of normalcy, even as the ocean outside remained indifferent to its passage. A faint metallic hum resonated through the hull, a subtle vibration that seemed to originate not from the engines, but from some deeper, uncharted layer of the submarine. Crew members paused briefly, listening to the faint sound, yet nothing appeared to be malfunctioning. The hum continued, a low note beneath the standard operational noises, and its origin could not be traced with certainty. In hindsight, investigators would later wonder if this vibration had been a prelude, a small but telling marker of a mechanical anomaly or an environmental stress that went unnoticed amid the routine of the mission. Outside, currents carved invisible paths around the submarine. The South Atlantic was a vast and shifting body, a cold expanse in which depth and pressure created a reality detached from the surface world. Temperature gradients and salinity layers formed hidden boundaries that distorted sonar readings and misled even the most advanced instruments. The water was not static, it moved with silent precision, and every knot of current had the potential to affect navigation, structural stress, and even acoustic detection. These movements, invisible to the human eye, were a reminder of the ocean's indifferent and often inscrutable presence. The last recorded log noted a minor power fluctuation, a blip that passed without further comment. The crew recorded it in the routine of operational checks, assuming a momentary instability in the electrical grid. The entry was mundane, almost trivial, yet it would later attract intense scrutiny. Analysts pored over the log in search of correlations to the disappearance, debating whether a small irregularity might have cascaded into a fatal failure. At the time, though, the entry reflected nothing more than a normal day in the life of a submarine navigating deep waters under the watch of a disciplined crew. Sonar pulses returned shapes that could not be identified, echoing through the water like fragmented whispers. Each ping sent out by the vessel's instruments came back altered, distorted by layers of depth, temperature, and shifting underwater terrain. The echoes hinted at movement, yet no ship, submarine, or natural phenomenon fully accounted for the readings. Later reconstructions would show that these signals created patterns difficult to reconcile with known oceanography, suggesting either an unusual event within the hull or anomalies in the surrounding sea that remained unexplained. Charts and navigational models offered little clarity, as the South Atlantic currents created pockets of turbulence that seemed almost deliberate in their concealment. Even the most advanced mapping systems aboard the submarine failed to reconcile expected positions with actual acoustic feedback. Small, shifting thermoclines bent sound waves unpredictably, producing phantom echoes that mimicked the presence of objects that were not there. Crew members recorded these anomalies in passing, unaware that they were cataloguing the very distortions that would later confound investigators and challenge assumptions about what the submarine encountered in its final hours. Air pressure shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, creating minute variations in the cabins and control rooms. The crew may have felt the change, but routine checks found no immediate cause. These fluctuations, insignificant in the moment, became part of a larger puzzle pieced together by investigators months later. Pressure sensors on the hull, analysed remotely, recorded changes consistent with neither standard dives nor expected structural strain, leaving forensic teams to speculate on what forces, internal or external, might have been at play. Voices in the crew compartment carried uncertainty, not panic, in the final recorded communications. Messages were clipped, brief and procedural, with small deviations from standard phrasing that seemed inconsequential at the time. Every word, every pause was later analysed for clues, forming a lattice of possible interpretations. Researchers debated whether minor hesitations hinted at mechanical trouble, procedural confusion, or merely the stress of long hours underwater. The subtlety of human behaviour inside the submarine became part of the enigmatic narrative, a traceable yet ultimately incomplete window into events beneath the waves. A distant echo suggested movement, though no vessel was near. Acoustic arrays detected vibrations unlike any previously catalogued, and the patterns were neither consistent nor predictable. Analysts struggled to differentiate between external interference, geological shifts, and internal structural anomalies. These echoes haunted the search and recovery efforts, introducing ambiguity into every reconstruction. No simulation or model could fully replicate the acoustic signature, leaving an open question as to what exactly the submarine experienced in its final hours. Temperature readings defied standard calibration, fluctuating in ways that seemed physically impossible. Instruments designed to operate within strict parameters produced erratic outputs, hinting at thermal gradients, electrical interference, or deeper structural stress. Scientists reviewing the data noted that the anomalies were localized to specific sections of the hull, raising questions about whether the events originated internally, externally, or in some interaction between vessel and ocean. The irregularities remained unexplained, a puzzle without resolution that contributed to the vessel's enduring mystery. Instruments recorded vibrations with no discernible source, creating data that confounded naval engineers. Each sensor suggested a series of shocks or oscillations too complex to attribute to normal operation. These readings, once dismissed as noise or error, later became central to forensic studies, revealing how a combination of environmental and structural factors might have intersected at a single, unknowable moment. Even with modern analysis, the origin of these vibrations remains contested, reinforcing the uncertainty surrounding the disappearance. Debris later found miles apart hinted at sudden structural failure, yet the pattern defied conventional explanation. Fragments were scattered across unexpected distances, with damage inconsistent with controlled demolition or simple implosion. Investigators have suggested multiple hypotheses, from internal explosion to cascading hull collapse, yet none fully accounts for the dispersal, leaving lingering questions about the submarine's final moments and the ocean's role in dispersing the wreckage. Water density anomalies obscured conventional scanning methods, complicating every attempt at mapping the vessel. Layers of colder, saltier water created pockets in which sonar signals bent, refracted, and disappeared. Search teams noted the difficulty of interpreting readings, as if the ocean itself resisted observation. The interplay of physics and environment transformed the task into something more than technical. It became an exercise in confronting the unknowable, or even sophisticated tools failed to illuminate the truth. Families' messages waited unanswered, suspended in time. Across the coastlines of Argentina, loved ones anticipated updates that never arrived. The emotional landscape mirrored the physical one, marked by gaps, uncertainty, and the haunting presence of what could not be recovered. Letters, phone calls, and prayers accumulated into an echo of absence, a silent reflection of the submarine's disappearance that paralleled the mysterious patterns recorded in the South Atlantic. Recovery teams observed patterns that contradicted prior simulations, forcing re-evaluation of the vessel's structural behaviour. ROV footage, sonar sweeps, and fragment analysis suggested forces and events previously deemed impossible. Every attempt to reconstruct the incident highlighted discrepancies between expectation and reality, creating a tension between empirical evidence and human interpretation. These contradictions became central to the narrative, emphasizing the unknowable qualities of deep-sea operations and the limits of even modern technology in fully explaining what happened. In the darkness, the submarine seemed suspended between worlds, neither fully present nor entirely gone. Its remains rest beneath immense pressure, surrounded by currents, darkness, and silence. Every fragment, every signal, every anomaly contributes to a story that cannot be told in full, a narrative composed of traces, echoes, and questions that refuse closure. The vessel exists as both a technical object and a spectral presence, a marker of human ambition, vulnerability, and the ocean's enduring mystery. Even after years of investigation, analysis, and international collaboration, the South Atlantic keeps the secrets of ARA San Juan. USS Tang, 1944, Taiwan Strait, Pacific Ocean. The patrol began under a sky streaked with pale dawn, the sea calm and reflective, as if the waters themselves were holding their breath. Tang, already renowned for its lethal precision, cut silently through the Taiwan Strait, each crew member executing their duties with practiced exactitude. Instruments hummed with routine efficiency, sonar operators scanned for distant echoes, and the captain reviewed tactical maps, calculating angles and distances with meticulous care. There was no hint of impending disaster, only the quiet rhythm of a submarine on patrol, confident in its design, its crew, and its mission. Charts detailed the intricate channels of the strait, noting reefs, currents, and shoals that could imperil even the most experienced navigator. Tang's officers studied the maps repeatedly, aware that enemy vessels and minefields were a constant threat. Depth and positioning were critical. One miscalculation could mean disaster. The combination of oceanography, tide, and enemy traffic created a complex puzzle, and the crew approached it as a matter of duty and survival. Each course correction, each sonar ping, was an attempt to impose order on a vast and indifferent ocean. Crew members adjusted periscopes and monitored sonar readings, noting subtle variations in water density and temperature. Every detail was scrutinized, every anomaly logged. Even minor deviations in instrument readings demanded attention, for in the environment of the Taiwan Strait, small errors could propagate with deadly consequences. The submarine's interior was a controlled chaos of switches, dials, and gauges, each one representing potential salvation or failure, and the crew's awareness of this duality lent their movements a quiet tension. Mechanical inspections before departure had flagged minor irregularities in several torpedo guidance systems, none severe enough to delay the patrol, yet enough to warrant a subtle caution among the engineering crew. These discrepancies were logged, cross-checked, and then seemingly set aside in favour of mission urgency. In hindsight, investigators would later speculate that these minor deviations, when combined with the submarine's speed, current patterns, and rapid firing sequence, may have contributed to the catastrophic reversal of the torpedo's path. The record of these technical notes became a focal point in debates over whether human oversight or an improbable mechanical flaw ultimately sealed Tang's fate. Intelligence reports indicated a convoy of Japanese ships ahead, each vessel a potential target. The briefings suggested patterns of travel, cargo estimates, and escort strategies, but nothing could guarantee the accuracy of the information. Tang's officers plotted intercept courses, factoring in speed, distance, and the risk of counterattack. The calculus was exact, yet laden with uncertainty. The enemy was never fully visible, never entirely predictable, and the margin for error was perilously small. Torpedo tubes were loaded and cross-checked with meticulous care. Each missile represented the culmination of months of preparation, technical refinement, and strategic planning. The crew verified alignment, fuel levels, and mechanical calibration, aware that a single malfunction could imperil the vessel or betray its presence. The checks were both mechanical and psychological. Confidence in the equipment was as crucial as knowledge of the enemy, for hesitation or doubt could prove fatal in the moments that followed. The captain reviewed the firing solution with calm precision, tracing trajectories and potential impact points. He understood the risks inherent in launching multiple torpedoes in sequence and accounted for currents, depth, and vessel speed. Yet even in this controlled environment, variables existed beyond calculation. The mechanical and human components were finely tuned, but they were not infallible. A convergence of forces beyond comprehension could transform a disciplined attack into a catastrophe. Instruments registered currents that threatened to alter trajectory, subtle shifts in the water that could redirect a torpedo by degrees, small enough to escape notice yet large enough to produce unintended consequences. The engineers monitored them carefully, applying corrections where possible. Despite all precautions, the ocean retained its own agency, bending the expected course of events with an indifference that defied human planning. The sea was a co-conspirator and a confounding element simultaneously, shaping outcomes in ways the crew could not predict. Attentive eyes caught the subtle quiver of the torpedo as it launched, a mechanical sigh through the water. It travelled along its assigned course, a tool of precision under the watch of the best-trained crew. Yet something imperceptible began to deviate. The interaction of currents, the spin of the torpedo, or perhaps an internal defect in guidance. In those moments, no human eye could discern the impending tragedy. The missile obeyed physics, but physics itself had betrayed the designers, creating a paradox in motion that would culminate in calamity. Moments later, alarm sounded with a stark clarity, cutting through the submarine's routine. The crew reacted instantly, checking logs, instruments, and torpedo readings. Confusion briefly rippled through the control room as reality clashed with expectation. The vessel's own weapon had turned back toward it, an improbable trajectory that seemed impossible given every calculation. Officers exchanged hurried words, attempting to reconcile what had occurred with the operational logic they had trained for years to uphold. Damage reports revealed an outcome that defied immediate logic. Hull breaches, flooding, and electrical failures compounded in rapid succession. The submarine's systems, built to endure stress, struggled against a force that originated from within rather than the external environment. Crew members attempted countermeasures, sealed compartments, and emergency protocols, but the nature of the accident left little room for intervention. Tang had become a victim of its own lethality, an embodiment of the fine line between control and chaos. Conflicting accounts from the crew's brief escape attempts hinted at moments of near-simultaneous heroism and confusion, though much of the testimony remained partial due to the chaos and rapid sinking. Observers reported that emergency maneuvers were executed flawlessly under extreme duress, yet the very precision of these actions could not counteract the unnatural trajectory of the torpedo. Analysts later noted how quickly cascading failures, mechanical, electrical, and structural, interacted, producing a situation where standard protocols were rendered ineffective. The incident highlighted not only the limits of training and preparation, but also the eerie precision with which chance and circumstance converged to overwhelm even the best prepared crew. Rescue efforts were hampered by the narrow straits and enemy activity. Nearby vessels could not approach safely, and communication with command was fragmented. The rapid sinking left scant time for distress signals, and many potential witnesses remained unaware of the precise events unfolding underwater. Analysis of these logistical constraints would later inform naval procedures, but at the time, the convergence of environmental, mechanical, and tactical factors produced a scenario that human planning could not overcome. Subsequent analysis suggested mechanical anomalies compounded by human decisions, a tangled web in which causality became nearly impossible to trace. The torpedo's behaviour, the captain's commands, and the crew's responses were all examined repeatedly, yet definitive conclusions remained elusive. Investigators debated whether the disaster was preventable, inevitable, or a confluence of extraordinary chance. The precision of the accident, the alignment of variables rendered it simultaneously comprehensible in hindsight and incomprehensible in the moment. Historical accounts continue to debate the precise sequence of events. Memoirs, technical reports, and declassified documents offer perspectives that often conflict, leaving a murky record. Each narrative attempts to reconcile probability with the extraordinary, but the rarity of the incident ensures it will never fit neatly into conventional explanations. Tang's story occupies a space between operational history and the extraordinary, a case study in how human ingenuity can coexist with catastrophic misfortune. Modern experts remain divided on whether the disaster was avoidable. Advanced simulations and engineering studies illuminate potential mechanical flaws or procedural gaps, yet they cannot recreate the precise combination of forces, timing, and human interaction that produced the outcome. The case challenges assumptions about control, precision, and accountability, leaving a tension between what should have happened and what inevitably did. Tang exists in memory as both a triumph of naval skill and a cautionary tale of improbable convergence. Tang's legacy endures, both celebrated and haunted by the impossible accident. It serves as a reminder of the fine margins that separate mastery from misfortune and of the ocean's ability to transform precision into tragedy in the blink of an eye. Every analysis, every report, every reflection on the event returns to the same uncomfortable truth. Even the best-trained crew operating under the most favourable conditions can become subject to the improbable forces that govern war, machinery, and the sea. The torpedo that once served as a weapon of dominance became the instrument of inevitability. USS 09, 1941, Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic surface mirrored the sky, smooth and deceptively calm as USS 09 prepared for its routine test dives off the coast of Portsmouth. The morning light glinted against the steel hull, suggesting serenity that belied the pressures and perils below. Officers reviewed their dive plans one final time, scanning instruments and charts, noting each depth curve, each expected current. There was a rhythm to the preparations, quiet discipline that had guided the crew through countless exercises. Yet beneath the calm and unspoken awareness of the ocean's unforgiving nature lingered, like a shadow no one named aloud. Hatches sealed with precise alignment, enclosing the crew in metallic quiet. Inside, the submarine felt simultaneously protective and confining, the air dense with the scent of machinery and varnished wood. Every latch, every seal had been double-checked, yet the act of closing the hatches transformed the vessel into a hermetically sealed microcosm. The crew settled into routines, checking gauges, calibrating instruments, and noting minor fluctuations in pressure. Each step was mechanical, efficient, and seemingly ordinary, yet the enclosed environment amplified the smallest deviation into an anomaly impossible to ignore. Gauges indicated depth, pressure, and temperature with scrutiny. Lieutenant officers recorded readings with meticulous attention, aware that the reliability of each instrument was crucial to the success of the dive. Small variations, almost imperceptible, were logged and annotated, but no pattern suggested immediate danger. The ocean outside was a silent and unpredictable force, and the careful monitoring was both a precaution and a ritual, a method of imposing order on a world that offered none. Routine system checks revealed minor inconsistencies that puzzled even the most experienced officers. Temperature gauges along the battery compartments showed subtle, transient spikes, while pressure valves occasionally ticked without cause. Crew members noted that these fluctuations did not interfere with operations, yet their recurrence hinted at underlying mechanical tension. Some hypothesized that repeated dives or the cumulative stress of water pressure could have amplified microfractures in piping or hull sections. Though innocuous in isolation, these inconsistencies formed a hidden prelude to the extraordinary events that would unfold, offering investigators a small but critical window into the vessel's vulnerability. Crew voices carried softly through the narrow compartments, a blend of procedural commands and muted conversation. The hum of electrical systems and pumps underscored the human presence, a fragile layer of life enveloped by steel and water. The proximity of the crew to one another created a shared intimacy, a rhythm of coordination and trust. Every footstep, every whispered instruction resonated within the confined space, creating a subtle awareness of both connection and vulnerability. A subtle vibration travelled along the hull, unnoticed at first, a ghostly echo of tension between structure and environment. Its origin was ambiguous, perhaps a minor mechanical quiver, perhaps the first sign of external pressure building silently. No alarm sounded, no immediate reaction was warranted. Yet, retrospectively, the vibration would be recorded in logs and remembered in diver accounts as a faint prelude to the calamity that followed. The submarine seemed, in that instant, almost sentient in its response to the unseen forces pressing from outside. Instruments recorded readings that did not match expected norms, anomalies that were minor enough to escape immediate concern but strange enough to intrigue the officers. Temperatures fluctuated in microgradients, pressure sensors ticked inconsistently, and sonar picked up faint echoes without identifiable sources. The data was catalogued and dismissed as minor irregularities. Still, these discrepancies would later form a mosaic of questions, hinting at the hidden stresses that had quietly compounded during the test dives. The dive plan proceeded according to standard protocol, a sequence designed to test the submarine's performance under calm water conditions. Each maneuver was deliberate, each depth change methodically executed. Crew members followed routines drilled into muscle memory, relying on procedure to maintain control. Yet, as the submarine descended, the weight of water increased in ways that were perceptible even to the most disciplined senses. The calm surface betrayed nothing of the slow, inexorable pressures that would soon become lethal. Outside, currents shifted imperceptibly beneath the vessel. Invisible streams of colder or denser water interacted with the hull in ways undetectable to the crew, yet significant enough to alter stability. These subtle hydrodynamic forces, combined with the submarine's own movement, created micro-stress points along the frame. Such stresses were not alarming in isolation, but they contributed to a larger unseen tension that would only be understood after catastrophe. Logs noted minor mechanical quirks, unremarkable in isolation but cumulatively noteworthy. Small rattles, unexplained gauge fluctuations, and intermittent sonar readings were recorded by officers in routine diligence. No single anomaly predicted disaster, yet together they formed a pattern that hinted at the fragile balance between design, human operation, and the immutable forces of the Atlantic. The vessel's systems were tested, the crew prepared, and yet fate operated outside all expectations. From deep within the hull, faint taps resonated long after the sinking. Divers recount the strange auditory signals, rhythmic yet inconsistent, suggesting movement or communication from inside the sealed wreck. Some hypothesized trapped air pockets, others imagined the hull flexing under pressure, but the reports remained tantalizingly inconclusive. The taps became part of the legend of USS 09, a haunting reminder that even after death, the submarine's presence persisted in the form of mystery and sound. Odd phenomena caught the divers' attention as they documented anomalies that suggested internal activity beyond explanation. Remotely operated vehicles captured glimpses of interior compartments, empty yet echoing with residual energy of the crew's final moments. Acoustic sensors picked up minor vibrations, too regular to be purely environmental, too faint to pinpoint definitively. These observations reinforced the eerie sense that 09, despite being a submerged and sealed vessel, maintained a spectral presence beneath the Atlantic waves. Strange signals defying conventional interpretation were captured by acoustic devices. Analysts noted rhythms, pauses, and amplitudes inconsistent with natural or mechanical phenomena. The data was catalogued, scrutinized, and debated, yet no consensus emerged. Some suggested residual pressure equalization, others speculated on unknown interactions between metal, water, and air. Regardless, the signals amplified the submarine's mystique, emphasizing that the Atlantic had not released its hold on 09's story. While clarifying certain points, official reports reconciled some discrepancies but left lingering questions. Naval archives confirmed timelines, mechanical assessments, and diver observations, yet could not fully explain the disappearance. Every document, each technical evaluation, highlighted the limits of human knowledge in the face of deep-sea enigmas. The submersible, once a symbol of human ingenuity, had become a monument to the unknown forces of the ocean. Historical records preserved testimonies that were fragmented yet haunting. Officers' notes, divers' accounts, and contemporary analyses offered glimpses of life aboard, the operational environment, and the strange acoustic phenomena encountered post-sinking. Piecing together these fragments produced only partial clarity, emphasizing the gap between human understanding and the submerged reality of 09. Each record contributed to an enduring tension between explanation and the unknowable. Clinging to the shadows of history, the submarine's silence remained a puzzle unsolved. Researchers continue to probe the Atlantic depths, instruments and technology advancing beyond what the crew could have imagined, yet the faint tapping and anomalous readings remain, defying complete resolution. 09 rests beneath immense pressure, surrounded by currents, darkness, and questions that span generations. Its story is at once ordinary in its operational context and extraordinary in the mysteries it left behind. Darkness enveloped the steel and water where something waited that would never speak. HMS Victoria, 1893, Eastern Mediterranean. The sun struck the polished decks, catching masts and rigging in a brittle shimmer, casting the ships in the fleet as monumental yet fragile structures. The Eastern Mediterranean stretched calm and endless beyond the horizon, a deceptive placidity that belied the discipline and tension among the sailors. HMS Victoria, the flagship of the fleet, stood proud, her towering masts and iron hull a testament to British naval power. Yet even as the vessel seemed immovable, a subtle unease threaded through the ranks, a sense that perfection in manoeuvre could slip quietly into catastrophe. Whispers travelled along the lines of the fleet, cautious and deliberate. Officers murmured about minor misalignments in formation, about hesitation in the execution of orders, and about subtle discrepancies in the relay of signals. These murmurs were dismissed outwardly as prudence or routine, yet internally they sowed doubt and an awareness that even disciplined obedience could mask vulnerability. Every sailor sensed the invisible tension, a nervous anticipation that did not need articulation to be understood. The Admiral observed the horizon, calculating yet uneasy. His eyes swept the ranks of ships, noting spacing, alignment, and adherence to drill. Every movement was scrutinized, every hesitation weighed. Yet despite his experience and command, the complex interplay of vessels, wind, and human reaction was not fully controllable. The calm waters became a stage where invisible forces, human perception, pride, and tiny errors could converge into catastrophe. Flags fluttered with coded meaning, their significance debated among signal officers. Semaphore and lanterns carried instructions that demanded precision, yet interpretation was never perfect. Signals could be misread, delayed, or lost in the ambient confusion of a vast fleet. The act of translation from command to execution introduced vulnerability, as if the very communication that maintained order contained within it the seeds of misjudgment. Cannons and machinery were tested routinely, producing a background hum that mingled with the creak of timber and iron. Even in calm seas, the subtle vibrations of these tests were transmitted along the decks, a reminder that every part of the ship was alive with energy and potential consequence. Sailors, trained to ignore the minor sounds, could not help but sense a quiet tension, an almost imperceptible rhythm suggesting that the ship itself anticipated the collision long before human awareness caught up. Deckhands shifted their weight, sensing both pride and apprehension. The weight of tradition, of expectation, pressed down on them as heavily as the rigging above. Each sailor moved with care, performing duties that were rote yet critical, knowing that the slightest misstep could ripple outward through the coordinated movement of dozens of vessels. The tension was invisible but palpable, an undercurrent flowing beneath the apparent ceremony of the manoeuvres. A distant lookout squinted at the shadow of an approaching vessel. The sun's glare and the glitter of the waves distorted distances, creating uncertainty where certainty was required. Lines of sight converged imperfectly, leaving gaps in perception that no amount of experience could entirely correct. The fleet moved as a singular entity, yet the individuals responsible for maintaining awareness carried private doubts, each unnoticed by the others but cumulatively significant. Bells tolled rhythmically, marking time yet failing to steady nerves. The cadence underscored the precision demanded by the manoeuvres, but also emphasized the inflexibility of command. Orders had to be executed without hesitation, yet the rigidity of expectation collided with the subtle realities of navigation, human reaction, and environmental variability. Each chime echoed the duality of the fleet. Disciplined unity and the potential for disaster, conversations overlapped with orders, creating a chorus of tentative certainty. Officers interpreted commands, relayed instructions, and watched the reactions of other ships. Misalignment, even a fraction of a degree, was amplified across the formation. Moments of hesitation compounded, and yet the tempo of expectation allowed no pause, no reconsideration. The precision that maintained discipline also accelerated the approach toward the unforeseen. Wood and iron gleamed under midday light, monumental yet fragile, reflecting both pride and hubris. Observers later noted the contrast between the vessel's imposing presence and the fragility of its position within the fleet. The physical strength of the ships belied the delicate choreography required for safe manoeuvring, a choreography vulnerable to the smallest misinterpretation, the slightest delay, the unremarkable error magnified by proximity. Rumours of prior mishaps circulated quietly, unacknowledged yet persistent. Sailors and officers remembered earlier exercises where minor miscalculations had nearly resulted in collisions. These stories circulated without formal documentation, becoming part of the fleet's private consciousness. The awareness of history added a layer of tension, a subtle expectation that the fleet's perfection was provisional and that disaster could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances. Lines of sight intersected imperfectly, leaving gaps in perception. The flagship's position relative to the other vessels created blind spots. Angles of approach, wind, and currents introduced variables that could not be fully predicted. Commanders relied on calculation, instinct, and trust, yet the combination of environmental and human factors created a web of uncertainty. Each captain acted with confidence, unaware of how those small choices collectively approached catastrophe. Wind and current shifted in ways that defied prediction, subtly altering the ship's alignments as they moved in formation. Even the most disciplined crews could not fully account for these invisible forces, which acted like hidden hands nudging vessels toward catastrophe. Logbooks later recorded minor course corrections, seemingly inconsequential at the moment, that would prove critical in the chain of events leading to the collision. From their vantage, observers later described the air as electric, poised on the edge of inevitability. There was no dramatic omen, no sudden warning, only a tension that intensified as the fleet maintained formation. Even the calm Mediterranean seemed complicit, its smooth surface a silent observer of the human error building beneath. The world held its breath, and the line between ceremony and disaster blurred imperceptibly. Piecing together diaries, logs, and fragmented testimony, historians reconstruct events, revealing both the exact sequence of commands and the subtle ambiguities that made disaster possible. Misinterpretations, delayed acknowledgements, and the psychological weight of hierarchy converged to create a moment that could not be reversed. Each reconstruction emphasizes human fallibility, yet also the chilling precision with which disaster unfolded when multiple small failures aligned. Memorials and wrecks endure as silent reminders of human misjudgment. HMS Victoria's bow rests beneath the Mediterranean waves, a monument to the intersection of pride, procedure, and miscommunication. Divers and archaeologists encounter the vessel as both a historical artifact and a narrative of inevitability, where every plank, gun, and mast carries the weight of what was lost. The ship is a vessel of memory, holding both the tangible wreckage and the intangible lessons of human error. Survivor accounts, few and fragmented, describe moments of frozen awareness, the instant when routine expectation transformed into imminent disaster. Officers reported seeing other ships approach at impossible angles, signals misread, and orders contradicted by the geometry of the fleet. These recollections, vivid yet partial, reinforced the impression that the collision was not sudden, but the result of a slow convergence of errors, tensions, and unseen forces acting with almost deliberate precision. Even today, the Eastern Mediterranean carries the echo of a collision never fully comprehended. The waves lap against the invisible contours of the sunken ship, indifferent to rank, protocol, or foresight. It is a reminder that even in a controlled environment, with orders obeyed and discipline enforced, catastrophe can emerge silently, with the precision of inevitability. Somewhere beneath the calm waves, the shadow of Victoria waits to be understood. K219, 1986, North Atlantic Ocean. Ice-chilled waves lapped against the hull, carrying silence and distance as K219 patrolled the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. The ocean was a living entity, indifferent to strategy, orders, and the lethal cargo contained within the submarine's steel walls. Above, the wind scattered frosted spray, while below the submarine drifted in a world of darkness and isolation. Every surface reverberated faintly with the weight of the ocean, reminding the crew of both their power and fragility. Log entries noted fluctuations in voltage that had no immediate explanation. Engineers recorded brief surges, circuits that hummed differently, and instruments that occasionally froze before resuming normal readings. These anomalies were catalogued meticulously, yet none seemed sufficient to predict what lay ahead. Each log was a silent witness, a fragment of a story that refused to cohere fully even to those who lived it. The crew moved through corridors heavy with anticipation and uncertainty, performing tasks both routine and critical. Every turn, every adjustment to dials or valves was executed with careful deliberation, yet the knowledge of what could go wrong lingered in peripheral thought. Their training was exacting, their discipline unwavering, but the tension of carrying nuclear warheads in a vessel designed for stealth amplified the psychological pressure beyond measure. Air quality sensors registered subtle fluctuations, unnoticed at first, that hinted at hidden leaks or compromised compartments. Officers monitored carbon dioxide and oxygen levels, while crew members continued their work with disciplined efficiency, unaware that the slight changes could exacerbate stress and fatigue. These imperceptible shifts underscored how a seemingly stable environment could conceal dangers that no instrument could fully explain. A distant sonar ping echoed, its source unidentifiable. Officers leaned close to screens and listening devices, straining to interpret the meaning behind a sound that could signify danger or nothing at all. Each ping added to the web of uncertainty, an auditory spectre in a submarine already thick with anticipation and apprehension. Outside, the Atlantic currents moved invisibly, shaping the submarine's course in ways no crew could fully perceive. Reactor monitors glowed, flickering under dim red lighting, casting eerie shadows across the control room. Every gauge was scrutinized, every fluctuation debated among officers as they attempted to reconcile the mechanical readings with the operational protocols. It was a constant negotiation between human understanding and the unknowable tendencies of complex systems under extreme pressure. Communications with command remained intermittent, fragmented, and tense. Signals arrived late or distorted, providing incomplete guidance. Analysts later concluded that these breaks in contact exacerbated the uncertainty on board, forcing the crew to rely on experience, instinct, and the fragments of information that could be gathered from the instruments alone. The submarine existed in a bubble of partial knowledge, surrounded by a sea that both concealed and threatened. Mechanical alarms whispered faint warnings that seemed almost imagined. A soft vibration here, a flicker there, often dismissed as minor, accumulated to form an oppressive sense of unease. Crew members recorded anomalies with clinical precision, while also noting the subtle increase in anxiety within the vessel. The line between caution and fear blurred as the day progressed, each small signal magnified by its unknown significance. Outside, the Atlantic's currents shifted with invisible weight. Temperature gradients, undersea turbulence, and the passage of distant vessels all influenced the submarine's movement imperceptibly. These forces, silent and indifferent, contributed to an environment in which K-219 was at once sovereign and entirely at the mercy of the ocean. Every decision made inside was an attempt to anticipate or counteract conditions that could not be fully measured or understood. Officers debated the meaning of readings that contradicted one another. Electrical surges, pressure fluctuations, and minor leaks were discussed in hushed tones, each interpretation tested against protocol, logic, and instinct. The uncertainty became a living presence, influencing decisions in subtle ways that would later be scrutinized by investigators. No choice was trivial. Every adjustment carried the potential to alter the chain of events in ways no one could foresee. Smoke and sparks marked the first evidence of an unseen breach. The missile compartment, designed with layers of containment and redundancy, revealed vulnerabilities that no one had anticipated. Crew members reacted immediately, isolating affected areas and initiating emergency protocols. The flickering lights and acrid scent of burned insulation intensified the already heightened tension, a tangible manifestation of the danger surrounding them. Attempts to isolate the breach intensified, each action a test of knowledge and nerve. Systems were rerouted, compartments sealed, and emergency procedures enacted with precision under impossible pressure. Logs captured each maneuver, each calculation, yet the mystery of the initial explosion remained unresolved. The crew's skill delayed disaster but could not entirely avert it, as forces beyond immediate perception continued to influence the submarine's fate. Reports from nearby Soviet vessels noted radiation readings that confounded initial explanations. Sensors detected anomalies inconsistent with standard containment, adding an element of uncertainty to the incident. Analysts speculated, documented, and debated, yet even the most meticulous reconstructions could not fully account for the unusual radiation patterns. The invisible presence of nuclear potential underscored the delicate balance of technology, environment, and human decision-making. Debriefings conducted months later revealed disagreements among intelligence analysts over the origin and magnitude of the radiation anomalies. Some suspected minor containment breaches, while others speculated about equipment malfunction or even undocumented events preceding the explosion. The conflicting conclusions highlighted the enduring opacity surrounding K219, reinforcing that even rigorous observation and analysis could not fully penetrate the mystery of what truly occurred inside the vessel. Fragments recovered months later refused to align with known engineering models. Metal twisted in ways that suggested forces beyond ordinary mechanics, while residual contamination hinted at processes that remained partially unexplained. Each recovered piece became evidence of both a heroic effort to contain disaster and a stubborn enigma resisting full comprehension. Engineers and investigators pieced together sequences from incomplete data, aware that no reconstruction could entirely capture what occurred in the vessel's final hours. Diaries and logs revealed moments of quiet heroism amid confusion. Officers and enlisted men faced decisions that balanced survival, operational integrity, and the potential for catastrophic release. Their actions were methodical, courageous, and constrained by partial knowledge, yet even their best efforts could not fully mitigate the unfolding events. These personal records provided insight into human resilience and uncertainty in a vessel governed as much by physics as by protocol. Oceanographers later noted subtle environmental anomalies near the wreck site. Currents, salinity, and temperature gradients in the vicinity of the sunken submarine hinted at lingering effects, both physical and radiological, that did not entirely conform to expectations. The ocean, indifferent yet persistent, maintained its role as both observer and participant in the enduring mystery of K219. Analysts reconstructed sequences from incomplete logs, highlighting both heroism and mystery. Each report, each fragmentary observation, added detail yet also amplified ambiguity. K219's story became a tapestry of uncertainty, a convergence of mechanical, environmental, and human factors resisting definitive explanation. The event was documented meticulously but remained enigmatic, a cautionary tale of technological power and the limits of human understanding. Across generations, the North Atlantic harbours questions no record or report can fully resolve. Divers, investigators, and historians confront fragments, radiation traces, and residual uncertainty, yet the full truth of K219's final moments remains elusive. The submarine rests beneath the waves, a silent witness to what technology, human endeavour, and the sea can conceal and reveal in equal measure. The Atlantic keeps its secrets in depths that no light, sound, or signal can fully illuminate. USS Grunion, 1942, Aleutian Islands, North Pacific. The periscope lens fogged under the Aleutian chill, capturing only blurred outlines of waves that rose and fell with a rhythm both predictable and alien. Beneath the surface, the submarine carved a path through waters that seemed to resist navigation itself. Ice and fog conspired to obscure the horizon, leaving only fragments of the world visible at any given moment. Instruments inside recorded data points that, taken alone, seem mundane, yet when viewed collectively, hinted at a story incomplete and partially unreadable. Hull rivets shivered under relentless wave pressure, tiny vibrations that travelled through steel and water alike. The submarine's skin bore the memory of each strike, each indentation pressed by wind, current, or unseen collision. Investigators later noted these patterns, realizing that they told a story of endurance and subtle failure, a narrative written in metal and salt rather than words. These details suggested not a single moment of catastrophe, but a sequence of tensions, each compounding the last. Sonar screens displayed silent gaps that defied interpretation. Pings returned sporadically, sometimes overlapping, sometimes vanishing entirely. Analysts would later speculate that these voids indicated sudden depth changes, unknown obstacles, or environmental anomalies unique to the Aleutian waters. The absence of clear readings became as significant as any signal. a quiet testament to the ocean's capacity for concealment, electrical panels bore signs of minor surges and irregularities, recorded in logs that survived only through indirect copies. Investigators pieced together their meaning decades later, suggesting fluctuating voltage that could compromise non-essential systems or subtly distort instrument readings. The panels themselves seemed to hold a silent testimony of the stresses endured, whispering clues about what had occurred beneath waves that no human eye could follow. Compass readings drifted subtly in ways that puzzled later observers. Navigational anomalies aligned neither with charts nor with natural magnetic variations, leaving speculation open to currents, mechanical faults, or perhaps minor alignment errors caused by repeated maneuvers. These subtle misalignments hinted at a vessel simultaneously precise and vulnerable, threading a narrow path through a sea that offered no margin for error. Depth gauges recorded fluctuations incongruent with expected currents. Some readings suggested sudden descents or rises uncorroborated by other instruments, as though the vessel had brushed against unseen underwater features or been subjected to forces invisible to those on board. The inconsistencies became critical clues for historians, suggesting moments when the submarine's trajectory diverged unexpectedly, contributing to the eventual disappearance. Currents and underwater topography combined to create areas of unusual pressure that were never fully documented. Investigators later noted that the submarine may have encountered subtle undersea turbulence, vortexes, or localized upwellings that stressed the hull in ways undetectable to the crew. Even minor fluctuations in water density or temperature could have influenced instrument readings, altered depth control, and contributed to subtle misalignments, adding layers of uncertainty to a patrol that vanished before a full explanation could be recorded. Air filtration units hummed irregularly, unnoticed at first, until technicians years later noted patterns indicative of strain. Small pressure differentials, minute fluctuations in airflow hinted at compartmental anomalies or potential system failure. While each irregularity seemed trivial alone, their accumulation painted a picture of a vessel operating at the very edge of environmental and mechanical tolerance, the ocean pressing silently against every seam. Signal logs showed fragmented bursts that never reached command. Partial transmissions, garbled messages, and lapses in radio contact formed a trail of uncertainty. Decades later, analysts would pore over these fragments, attempting to reconstruct orders, reports, and routine check-ins. Each lost or corrupted signal became both a clue and a source of frustration, emphasizing how much of Grunion's final patrol remained beyond comprehension. Ice accumulation clung to external structures, weighing them unevenly and subtly influencing balance. Frozen spray collected on the hull, rudders, and conning tower, introducing mechanical friction and stress at points never intended for constant pressure. Observers later noted that this buildup could have influenced depth control, trim, or even caused minor hull deformations, underscoring the unseen influence of the environment over engineered precision. Torpedo tubes contained traces suggesting both routine use and unexpected strain. Post-discovery examination revealed wear patterns inconsistent with recorded exercises, hinting at possible maneuvers under duress or mechanical anomalies that went undocumented. These traces told a silent story of preparation, action, and perhaps an attempt to respond to forces unknown, each imprint a fragment of an unresolved narrative. Buried among the salvage pieces, charts hinted at unexplored or misrecorded passages. Navigational markings, partially damaged by decades underwater, suggested that the submarine may have followed courses either planned or improvised, passing through currents, eddies, or obstacles poorly understood at the time. Each mark and tear in these charts contributed to the sense that Grunion's path was a puzzle only partially recoverable from scattered evidence. Wreckage analysis revealed bending patterns inconsistent with collision alone, steel twisted in irregular arcs, suggesting forces that combined environmental pressure, potential internal strain, and unknown mechanical events. Investigators noted these patterns with fascination and unease, aware that the full explanation might lie in moments never observed, decisions never recorded, or forces entirely unmeasured. Corrosion and marine growth formed maps of lingering forces over decades. Barnacles, rust trails, and biofilms traced water flow and stress lines on the vessel's remains. Forensic analysis of these living maps offered subtle insights into currents, pressure points, and interactions between the submarine and its environment, providing a slow-motion account of the forces that shaped its final resting place. Radar traces recorded only fleeting shadows that left no trace. Intermittent blips, caught by observers or post-war reports, suggested vessels, debris, or environmental artifacts that could not be confirmed. These fleeting impressions added to the puzzle, emphasizing the limits of observation and the North Pacific's capacity for concealment. Even instruments themselves seemed to whisper secrets that human eyes could not fully grasp. Pressure meters, depth gauges, and navigation instruments each held hints of anomalies, but none could convey a complete narrative. Combined with environmental variables, these clues formed a mosaic of uncertainty, emphasizing how much of Grunion's fate remained undeciphered. Drift patterns studied decades later suggested that the submarine moved through a complex weave of currents and undercurrents. Oceanographers noted that these flows could push vessels in ways unpredictable, even to experienced captains, adding a subtle, untraceable factor to the disappearance. Each shift, imperceptible at the time, became a key element in reconstructing the mystery from a distance. Marine acoustics revealed traces of implausible sounds recorded on distant monitoring stations. Low-frequency hums, metallic snaps, and bursts of pressure irregularities were later interpreted as the submarine interacting with both its own systems and the environment. These faint signatures, barely perceptible, reinforced the sense that forces beyond immediate perception had influenced the vessel's fate. Recovered personal logs and diaries offered glimpses of routine discipline and subtle anxiety. Officers and enlisted men recorded observations of minor leaks, fluctuating instruments, and environmental strain, though none could foresee the disappearance. These accounts, fragmented and incomplete, underscored the human dimension of uncertainty, adding depth to the object and environment-driven reconstruction. Using what little remained, investigators pieced together sequences from scattered evidence, revealing patterns without certainty. Each conclusion remained provisional, dependent on the interpretation of incomplete or ambiguous data. The combination of physical traces, environmental analysis, and sparse documentation created a narrative of probable actions and unknown consequences, emphasizing the enduring mystery of the Grunion's final patrol. Still untouched by modern probes, the North Pacific holds secrets beyond the reach of sonar, divers, or archival reconstruction. The Aleutian waters, cold and shifting, maintain their role as a silent witness to events partially known, partially inferred, and largely unresolved. The ocean preserves what cannot be told, hiding fragments of truth beneath waves that stretch into darkness where no light, sound, or human memory can ever fully reach. HMS Affray, 1951, English Channel, Atlantic. Training schedules marked a day of routine drills beneath overcast skies, the kind of calm that gave a false sense of security to crews and commanders alike. Affray had been designed for safety, tested for depth, and manned by personnel whose routines were ingrained to near perfection. Each maneuver followed protocols refined over decades, yet the very predictability of these exercises would become a shadowy measure against which the unknown would be judged. Hatch seals and valves bore the sheen of recent maintenance, inspected and recorded with meticulous care. Every bolt, gasket and hinge had been evaluated for wear and fatigue, with engineers confident that the vessel could withstand the pressures of even the deepest authorized test dives. Yet in these controlled measures lay the first hints of uncertainty, subtle signs that even the most disciplined procedures could not account for every eventuality. Sonar readings fluctuated without a clear explanation, subtle yet persistent. Blips appeared and vanished, signals that initially seemed random or attributable to distant marine life. Officers logged each anomaly with clinical detachment, noting the variations, yet their significance remained unknowable. Retrospective analysis would later suggest that the environment, currents, thermal layers, and undersea formations may have influenced these readings, but at the time they were nothing more than puzzling fragments on a screen. Officers recorded minor leaks that seemed insignificant at first glance. A few drops of condensation in compartments designed to withstand higher pressures, a faint hiss of escaping air in an unused conduit. Routine inspection dismissed these as negligible, but logs preserved them as fragments of evidence, small whispers of a system under strain that no one realized could escalate into catastrophe. Periscope observations revealed only calm waters and faint silhouettes on the horizon, a reassuring but deceptive stillness. Support vessels and distant cargo ships appeared as small, drifting shapes, innocuous and unthreatening. Yet the juxtaposition of this apparent serenity with the submarine's internal anomalies created a tension invisible to the casual observer, a quiet warning that procedure alone could not anticipate. Pressure gauges traced slow oscillations that suggested hidden strain. Not dramatic enough to trigger alarms, these subtle variations hinted at forces interacting with the vessel in ways not fully understood. Engineers noted them in passing, interpreting each as a minor anomaly, yet their accumulation would later appear as a thread in the tapestry of events leading to Affray's disappearance. Crew drills continued under a sense of disciplined monotony. Watch rotations, emergency procedures, and communications checks unfolded with exacting regularity. Every action demonstrated the skill and reliability of the men aboard, but no training could inoculate against the unknown variables that the vessel now faced, hidden beneath calm waves and structured routines. Navigation logs noted deviations too slight to provoke alarm yet too consistent to ignore. Compasses, charts, and depth readings occasionally conflicted, leaving gaps in the record that would later confound investigators. These subtle inconsistencies were the echoes of forces unperceived, a reminder that the controlled environment of a drill could not account for every interaction between machinery, crew, and the unpredictable ocean. External observers from support vessels reported nothing unusual until signals abruptly ceased. Radio communications, routine check-ins, and position reports stopped midstream, leaving silence where once there had been ordered noise. Investigators would later speculate that this abrupt disappearance coincided with a rapid, unexplained failure within the vessel, yet no definitive cause could be determined from the fragments that remained. Communication logs recorded fragmented orders and unanswered queries. Signals sent from command arrived partially corrupted, delayed, or unanswered entirely, creating an invisible chain of missing data. Analysts reconstructed patterns from these gaps, noting the increasing tension as the crew may have attempted to respond to a problem that had no precedent in their training. Each missing message became a marker of uncertainty, a piece of a puzzle that refused to resolve. Electrical panels occasionally flickered under steady load, hinting at subtle anomalies. Engineers noted voltage fluctuations, minor but persistent, and documented them without immediate concern. In retrospect, these small irregularities suggested that the vessel's systems were under environmental and operational stress beyond routine expectations. They represented a silent prelude, a signal whose full meaning would only be interpreted after tragedy had occurred. Test dives followed prescribed depths but left small inconsistencies in performance data. Instruments recorded variations in buoyancy, minor deviations from expected hull stress, and subtle oscillations in submersion speed. While none of these warranted alarm during the exercises themselves, they provided investigators with evidence of hidden instability, a technical whisper of the forces that would ultimately decide the vessel's fate. Hidden within the ship's schematics were modifications made during refits that were only partially documented. These undocumented changes involved minor adjustments to ballast systems and emergency vents that, while approved under routine safety checks, may have introduced unforeseen interactions between compartments during a dive. Engineers later speculated that under specific conditions, these alterations could have amplified small mechanical stresses, creating vulnerabilities that went unnoticed until the vessel disappeared. The combination of human oversight and incomplete records left investigators grappling with the possibility that the submarine's own structure contained subtle, invisible hazards. Upon review, investigators later noted patterns in equipment behavior that conflicted with expected norms. Reports compiled from surviving documentation, external vessel logs, and environmental data hinted at a series of cascading anomalies, each minor in isolation but collectively significant. The absence of a catastrophic warning at the time belied the latent hazards woven into the submarine's systems, suggesting that disaster had emerged from a combination of procedural trust and environmental unpredictability. Support divers discovered evidence decades later that hinted at structural compromise inconsistent with accidental collision alone. Hull plates bore stress lines that suggested sudden flexing under pressure, while internal systems displayed signs of rapid failure. Corrosion and marine growth formed maps of prolonged exposure to water and stress, creating a posthumous narrative of subtle decay and environmental interaction. Unusual tidal and current patterns in the channel may have played a hidden role. Oceanographers later noted that local currents during Affray's patrol were stronger and more erratic than standard charts indicated. These undercurrents could have shifted the submarine slightly off its intended course, applying unaccounted-for pressures to hull and control surfaces. When combined with the vessel's minor internal anomalies, the forces of the sea may have contributed to misalignments and subtle stresses that were impossible for the crew to perceive, leaving only traces for post-discovery reconstruction. Historical reconstructions combined official records, diver reports, and environmental observations to generate a mosaic of possibilities. Each attempt to reconstruct Affray's final moments underscored the fragility of understanding when relying on incomplete data. The investigation revealed patterns without certainty, pointing to mechanical, procedural, and environmental factors that converged in ways that remain enigmatic to this day. Lying untouched by time, the channel holds the echoes of routines interrupted and questions unresolved. Currents, tides, and weather conceal the vessel's resting place beneath a placid surface, leaving fragments of evidence scattered and partially obscured. The combination of human error, procedural limitations, and environmental unpredictability continues to challenge those who seek clarity, reinforcing the sense that some maritime mysteries are meant to endure. From nearby vessels, eyewitness reports revealed fleeting anomalies in surface activity. Crewmen aboard support ships recalled seeing small, unexplained disturbances on the water's surface, brief ripples or patches of discoloration that appeared and vanished without explanation. While initially dismissed as debris or wake from passing traffic, these accounts were later correlated with the approximate time of Affray's disappearance, suggesting a moment when the submarine may have been interacting with the water in unusual ways. These fleeting signs provided investigators with indirect evidence that the vessel had experienced conditions outside normal operational expectations. The waters of the English Channel keep secrets that no protocol, signal, or investigator can fully uncover.